Chapter 576, Evolver Hunter. Jake abruptly pulled his claws from the chest of the gray orc he had just impaled. A trickle of silvery blood dripped from the gaping wound, and the humanoid monster suspended in mid-air collapsed to the ground, its eyes lifeless. The goblin and orc digesters who had just ambushed him were retreating after their defeat, but he had no intention of letting them escape. Just as he was about to give chase, his body stumbled to a halt and a worry-filled frown appeared on his face. The vitality link? Who did this? Eyes closed and scrunching his eyebrows intensely, Jake weighed the pros and cons, but accepted the transfer of injuries all the same. As long as the head wasn't fatally wounded, he was fairly confident in his regenerative abilities. The real concern was the death mark, which was likely to activate if anything happened. Like Svara, he suddenly became aware of the hidden attribute of this faction skill. The vitality link was not pulled out of a hat. When this person had used the skill, Jake had been informed of its location, or at least the direction it was in. Few Murtharian nerds are rich enough to afford activating the vitality link. She reminded him before returning to her mute state. Right. Jake's face lit up. By process of elimination, it could only be Kyle, Will, Svara, or one of the felines. I hope you're all fine, he muttered worriedly. The next moment, the wound transfer took place, and a searing pain electrified his entire body. His titanium hard bones cracked all over, his tendons and muscles tore, while numerous bruises and lesions racked his body. Because of his superior constitution and vitality, his injuries were not as severe as Svara's, and his bones did not completely break, merely cracked. Taking the brunt of his new injuries, Jake abandoned his digester hunt and promptly teleported to the top of a tree after erasing his footprints. He then turned around, moving from tree to tree at increasing speed without ever leaving the reassuring protection of the canopy. Moments later, Jake recognized a rocky promontory forming a small cliff about 20 meters high and half as wide. It's here. Jake wasn't here by chance. He had been here before while fighting these goblins and had already spotted the cliff as a potential resting place. In this dungeon digester, Jake could not deliberately use his earth control to move underground. Until proven otherwise, the walls, ceiling, and floor included were part of the dungeon digester, and he had seen what awaited those who tried to dig their way out. He had already analyzed the floor with his senses and his bracelet and had come to the unnerving conclusion that this dirt and rock was alive. He doubted that his accelerated healing skill would work with this artificial organic soil. Only a few rocks, and a thin layer of soil in some places, escaped this standard, and this small cliff was one of them. According to She, other digesters had probably brought in these inert materials from outside to brighten up the place. Perhaps the dungeon digester had requested it, but the assimilation of materials could also have occurred during the creation of the dungeon itself. In those few moments when Jake was retracing his steps, he had used his ether core to generate as much heat and radiation as possible, and his swelling had already subsided. The healing of his fractures and muscle tears was also well underway. Upon authorizing the wound transfer, Jake had feared the worst and rushed to find an ideal hiding place to maximize his regeneration, but what he feared had not happened. No additional injuries had been incurred, and when he reached the base of the cliff, the vitality link died down. Phew, false alarm. Jake exhaled tiredly. This level of injury required no help. His recovery would be complete within minutes. Refusing to admit that he had turned back for nothing, Jake checked the remaining space in his space storage and faction vault and decided to fill them with the cliff section ahead. Slowly at first, he punched the cliff, then gradually picked up speed until his arms became so fast that the resulting blast sounded like a machine gun. When he accelerated again, there was only one continuous note whose shockwave manifested itself as a raging wind. Are you really trying to grind that cliff into powder? She's hologram quipped near his ear with an amused look. A few sword strokes would have been enough for this. Maybe, but it's clearly not as much fun. Jake grinned with a feral expression. Less than a minute later, the cliff had vanished and a small mountain of fine dust stood in its place. There was more than enough for his intended use, and without skipping a beat, he loaded his space storage and the faction vault's common space to the brim. He could already imagine the other members' complaints when they discovered that the faction vault was bursting at the seams with dust. At least now I won't have to worry about looking for a place to bury myself in case of serious injuries," Jake said as he rinsed his hands with some water to get rid of the dirt. In fact, he had planned on a few cubic meters of dirt in his space storage before coming to rescue Kyle's sister. But he had used the Vitality Link a bunch of times over the past few days to rescue the refugees in his group. No matter how careful he was, it would have been impossible for him to keep all those inexperienced members in perfect fighting condition otherwise. Their ether and body stats had improved, but not enough to allow them to quickly recover from multiple fractures and lethal injuries in a matter of moments. With those dozens of tons of crushed rocks, Jake was now considerably more serene and immediately started back in the direction he had just left. He could still smell the gray goblins and orcs that had ambushed him. Most of the refugees, if they were still alive, had probably stopped in a comfortable area for their level. Searching for them to rescue them was a waste of time, since help was supposed to arrive at any moment. At least that was She's conclusion, but Jake agreed with her. As a leader, he had to do his best to help them when he could, but he shouldn't just stop living for them, or their roles would reverse. In the end, he was the leader. He had the right to use them as much as they used him. After multiple skirmishes with the digesters in this forest, Jake had already figured out that this was a great place to train, not just for him. In fact, the monsters he had encountered were still too weak, and that was why he had continued to venture deeper down into the woods. The cavern on this floor might seem huge to a normal human, but to Jake, who could run or fly at supersonic speed, this place was barely bigger than a garden. If he wanted to, he could reach the infrastructure in the distance in 2 to 3 minutes. The only reason he was still far away was because he had erred on the side of caution and spent time understanding his surroundings and the enemies he was dealing with. Now it was time to step up a gear. Jake didn't fear any digester in this forest, not even the Taudis. To him, these large, scale-covered beasts were as clumsy and slow as sloths. As long as he avoided them, he had nothing to fear, not to mention that with his senses, he could hear them coming from a distance. Jake was not invincible, however. There were still people he feared in this forest, but they were not digesters. As he was about to catch up to the contingent of orcs and goblins he had been chasing, a cold chill ran down his spine, and he stopped dead in his tracks. With his telekinesis, he froze the air around him to prevent the sound of his abrupt breaking from spreading, then made himself invisible with his light control before dashing in another direction. A few hundred meters away, a huge black orc sniffed the air with a comical expression on his face, then sneered scornfully. Another cockroach. Motionless and invisible, Jake released his breath only when he was certain that Uraltak was not after him. He waited a few more minutes, then summoned up the courage to track him down. As the saying goes, the safest place is often the most dangerous place. Besides, he was curious to know what this powerful orc was really after. A moment later, a breeze blew and Jake reappeared where Uraltak had been standing. Unsurprisingly, the orc and goblin digesters he had been chasing had been wiped out. The ether had also been picked up, which spoke volumes about the greed of this sixth ordeal evolver. Jake had no idea what kind of carnage this black orc had left in his wake, but he got a little idea as he kept following him. After a few minutes of stalking from a safe distance, he came across not only the bodies of digesters, but also those of other evolvers. Their faces, when their heads were still on their shoulders, were bloodless and their eyes glazed over, a stream of drool dripping from their lips. Common to all, their oracle devices were nowhere in sight. Chapter 577 Easy Booty. Their souls were stripped from them before they died. She observed coldly. Not just their souls. Jake's face darkened as he said this. They were not in an ordeal. Losing their oracle device would have unpredictable long-term consequences. Examining the bodies, Jake discovered that there was no trace of liquid alloy left in them, not even in the brain. However, the death mark was no longer present, and they had not been resurrected. Ural had obviously learned from his previous experience. How is that possible? Jake had trouble hiding his shock. He quickly formulated several plausible hypotheses, but she spared him the hassle by giving him the answer directly. When their soul and spirit body was extracted, their bodies were still alive, but unresponsive. This is the perfect time to take away their bracelets completely, including the liquid alloy parasitizing their brains. Jake twitched imperceptibly as he noted his Oracle AI's choice of words, but they were on the same page. Deep down, he had hoped that even outside of an ordeal, the Oracle would have put some measure in place to preserve what was left of their bracelet, but it was useless if they were dead. In the end, the liquid alloy still went into the hands of another evolver. The digesters got nothing, and that's all that matters. She spoke. So what if it's a digester trying to steal these bracelets? Jake asked, his curiosity suddenly aroused. The weary sigh of his Oracle AI echoed in his head. Usually nothing. They take the liquid alloy, and that's it. As you know from your second ordeal, this alloy is made in the oldest systems, such as A0 from the crystallized spirit body of old evolvers, deceased or not. It is a precious resource, even for these monsters. The only thing we can do before our capture is to erase all data and connection to the Oracle system. No self-destruct measure? Jake blurted out upon receiving this delightful surprise. He had feared his head would explode in the event of disobedience or betrayal, but perhaps he had overestimated the Oracle's capabilities. She's next words brought him back to earth. Don't forget that the liquid alloy has infiltrated every cell, including your brain. Deleting the data does not only include the data in the bracelet, but also the data in your neurons. As the main ingredient is a purified mixture of soul stones, it is possible to ignite their energy to cause an explosion, but the Oracle would never do that. Why not? Because the liquid alloy is too valuable. She explained matter-of-factly. As for the technology itself, high-rank digesters can use wristbands as advanced as ours, if not even more so. Given the current situation in the mirror universe, the higher-ups prefer to let the enemy take the liquid alloy. It makes them stronger, but at least it can be taken back from them if they win. Don't ask me why, but the digesters don't self-destruct their liquid alloy either when compromised. Jake noticed that his Oracle AI was more talkative than usual. Those stolen bracelets had probably awakened some vivid memories she would have rather forgotten. She had also unintentionally dropped a bombshell. Some digesters also used bracelets like their own. As Jake continued to stalk Ural, he came across other victims, and each time, their souls and Oracle devices had been stolen. If Ural was adept at these practices, perhaps his Oracle device was even more advanced than his own. This would be the first time he faced such an opponent. Factoring in the energy boost provided by each Oracle rank promotion, Jake's face broke down in horror, and he retreated several miles before remembering that the trees in this forest appeared to be interfering with his mental sense and his Oracle scans just as much as the cave walls. If they were in a normal forest, Uraltak would surely have detected him long ago. I need to be more careful. Ural isn't the only high-rank evolver to roam this dungeon. Jake repeated to himself as he began to tread more carefully this time. From that moment on, Jake made sure to always have a tree trunk blocking his view at mid-distance, so that no scan could reach him by chance. In practice, this was simple enough considering the density of trees in this forest, but it was one thing to rely on luck and knowing it. Thinking back on his luck, Jake figured that without being aware of it, the ether of luck obtained thanks to Tim had already saved him from getting himself in some sticky situations several times. Perhaps he had just been lucky until now, and this ashy forest was not as simple as he thought. Continuing to track the Black Orc, Jake had long since lost sight of him, but now he was using his luck and tracking skills to stay on the right path. When he spotted more dead evolvers, he knew he hadn't made a mistake. This time he recognized the corpse. It was hard not to recognize it. Octopus tentacles cut into slices, a pronounced smell of iodine, and a blade broken in two of which he was the creator. Takoyaki, Jake concluded while closing the eyes of the octopus alien he had never heard speak. Whoosh. A ball of black fur and a trail of orange feathers flashed before his eyes, and the tentacle lying at his feet disappeared. From a nearby bush, he heard the mewing and gurgling of a certain cat and turkey squabbling. Seriously? A vein bulged across Jake's forehead as he saw the turkey selfishly trying to gobble up the tentacle like a large earthworm. Crunch was pulling on the other end, barely restraining himself from squashing the bird with his big paw. The only order he had given them the whole time was to keep their distance and follow him in silence. But it seemed that the sight of the alien octopus had whetted their appetites. Just as the two animals seemed intent on glaring at each other until the end of time, A deadly pressure fell on them, and Crunch let go of his tentacle tip. Nervous, the orange turkey swallowed loudly, and the tentacle disappeared into its mouth before getting stuck in its throat. The bird then coughed as Crunch gently patted him on the back with an envious but resentful expression. "This guy was one of us," Jake informed them sternly, then shook his head in exasperation. Crunch licked his lips in shame as he learned the truth, but his eyes kept sneaking peeks at the remaining tentacles from time to time, thinking he was subtle enough for his master not to notice. As for the turkey, it was full and had already moved back to its comfortable spot over the cat's back. If Takayaki was dead, then the corpses of Dickon and Nicolay were likely to be lying around too. Walking through the corpses, Jake did find Dickon, the short, stocky man from the planet Exor, but not Nicolay. Walking a little further, he found a corpse different from the others. Its cells were still active and charged with ether. Their heat had not yet dissipated, and even though this body was devoid of soul and bracelet, this corpse had not been left unharmed but cleanly decapitated. Apart from Takayaki and a few rare evolvers, few corpses shared this characteristic. My guess is that Ural did not manage to neutralize their death mark in time, or that their life force was too strong. When they lost their soul, the death mark strengthened too quickly for him to react. Jake agreed with Shi's reasoning, as he also recognized this corpse. It was Albert, the St. Bernard Leakin hanging out with Melcree. To be her second in command, he was undoubtedly a strong fourth ordeal evolver. Resuming his tracking, Jake encountered more dead evolvers and digesters along the way, but was also ambushed numerous times. He was getting tired of these weak monsters and let Crunch and the orange turkey vent their frustrations. The plump bird in particular needed physical activity to help him digest. Finally, at some point, when the infrastructure entered his field of vision, Jake met his first real enemy. This lone warrior was a digester orc like the previous ones, but his silver chitin exoskeleton covered every inch of his body, leaving only a thin horizontal strip of unprotected skin exposing two cruel silver irises. The gray orc held a heavy claymore that skimmed the ground with every movement, raising a cloud of dust. The orange turkey gulped and buried his neck in Crunch's fur, hoping to become invisible, while Crunch yawned sleepily before lying down under the shade of a tree. He had total confidence in his master. And Jake didn't disappoint. He flicked two fingers in front of him, and a deafening compressed wind bullet rocketed toward the enemy, so fast that the bang of the impact was not heard until after the monster's chest had blown apart. Jake scratched his head with a confused expression, but just reminded himself that style and power were not necessarily correlated. It was an elite orc digester. She argued, on this floor, it should be a mini-boss. Look, it dropped something. Jake wondered what she was talking about until he noticed a weird spherical crystal with a complex ether symbol glowing in it. Not only that, but the helmet had come off the orc's skull, indicating that it was not part of the exoskeleton. Intrigued, he scanned the two objects and his eyes popped out of his head when he saw their description. Ether skill, cleave. When activating the skill on a limb or weapon, the sharpness is doubled with a low probability of completely cleaving the target. The effect doubles with each level. Great Helm of the Undying. A helmet generated by a dungeon digester that can be dropped by certain monsters. Its resilience is equal to that of the defeated digester's exoskeleton. Attributes: Strength +2, Constitution +7, Perception +3. Passive skill: 1 chance out of 2 to survive a decapitation. The helmet is destroyed after the skill is activated. Chapter 578. Who's there? These two unexpected rewards had thrown his plans into complete disarray. For the first time, Jake began to experience in his gut what Krygo, the giant whale, meant. He didn't want to leave this place anymore, despite the enormous risks. Jake pinched the ugly silver great helm between his thumb and forefinger and applied some force. The metal chitin immediately deformed, confirming to him that this piece of equipment was just junk for an evolver of his level. On the other hand, the attributes and passive skill bundled with it were not bad. +7 in Constitution didn't sound like much, but that was based on his own body stats. His Murtharian body magnified his body stats by 8, which meant that a normal sedentary human would have a body constitution around 1.25, while a Terran super athlete was unlikely to exceed the 5-point threshold. Rescaled from when he was a mere untrained human himself, those 7 points were enough to multiply his toughness, endurance, and stamina by at least 5. If they had carried that helmet when they arrived on B-842, Jake would have been able to put up a fight against the Nosk in the camp where Tim had lost his mother. Maybe he could have even saved her, and the teenager wouldn't be an orphan like he was now. The helmet's passive skill was an odd one, but that kind of probability-dependent effect was perfect for someone like Tim with high luck. Even Jake, if he was wearing this helmet, could use his luck ether to activate the effect with 100% certainty. It was like having a second life. The ether skill cleave was more to his liking and suited his fighting style. However, considering the origin of this crystal, he didn't know if assimilating this ether symbol was safe. It should be fine, but this ether symbol is quite big and it doesn't mix well with the ether runes from your bloodline. It takes a lot of space, she explained perfunctorily. Jake lost interest after hearing his AI's answer. He had the basics down after memorizing the entire novice book on ether manipulation and caught the underlying meaning. I should keep them in the faction vault for now. Jake sighed. Maybe they would be useful to Will, Kyle, or Svara. Jake wasn't worried about the other members using it since he had created a separate space for the time of the mission. Even the other important members like the 2 sisters or his cousins didn't have the proper clearance level. It was then that he noticed that a spherical crystal like his had already been added to their common storage space. Picking up the crystal, Jake scanned the object and mumbled thoughtfully. Devour. They must have gotten it from one of those Tautai digesters, she said coolly. Sensing his interest, she said, it's a good skill, but the problem is the same as before. It takes place and won't integrate well with your bloodline and other skills. As I thought. Jake was not disappointed. If his life or the life of one of his comrades was in danger, these ether skills could make a difference. Besides, even though it was a real headache to extract an ether skill embedded in one's ether code, it wasn't impossible. It was just that it was only within the reach of the most skilled etherists. The ether runes making up one's ether code were innumerable and infinitesimally small. No Earth microscope could observe them, let alone study them. Alien technologies and powerful etherists with monstrous perception and soul were capable of doing so, but it remained an area of expertise reserved for the elite of the elite. As Jake had already experienced when performing his first ether and soul spells, these ether runes and symbols did not have to be so small, but they required more ether to exist and occupied space, potentially disrupting the flow of ether in the body. He could already tell that while these ether skills had the same properties as those displayed in the Oracle store, they were much cruder in design. If he wanted to use them, Jake would probably have to choose a place in his body to house the ether symbol, but that place would be unable to accommodate a second ether symbol of similar size, or in other words, another ether skill. Still, Jake could probably assimilate several dozen. Several dozen more ether skills could really make a difference. Don't despair. An etherist should be able to miniaturize them with the right equipment. It's much easier to shrink an existing ether symbol than to create one from scratch. She consoled him as he stood still. Jake exhaled slowly and set off again. After a few steps, he spoke his mind. I don't get why this dungeon digester is so generous. What does he get out of this? I can't remember. What I can say is that if the conditions are met, it keeps evolving into a calamity. Many systems fell because of these dungeons. Jake could think of many reasons for this, but he almost always came up with the same scenario. It was that given enough time, all the dungeon digesters would evolve into omniscient fortresses with invincible armies and eventually go on the offensive. All this free EXP, the skill and equipment drops were tempting, but Jake doubted the Oracle was fooled. Even though greedy and egotistical evolvers were legion, as long as the overseer at the helm stayed the course, there was little to fear. While corruption was possible, and it may happen by accident if a dungeon went undetected, it was certain that the Oracle and his guardians had many protocols in place to prevent it. Jake suddenly froze. The corruption? He had a nagging feeling that he was onto something. She said nothing, confirming that she also shared his hunch. Right now, he felt himself, but a shudder of foreboding still made his blood run cold. We need to leave this place. Although Jake said that, he quickened his pace toward the infrastructure. He encountered no other elite digesters, but several other victims of Ural attack. The groups were eclectic, indicating that many temporary alliances had been formed when these factions had been broken up. At some point, Jake reached the structure hidden by the forest canopy and could finally see what it was. It was another spiral rocky promontory resembling the mountain on the surface where they had come in, but much smaller in size. Rudimentary dwellings made of clay and thatch had been erected all around, as well as a sort of primitive castle on the hillside. This castle was more a pile of roughly hewn rocks than a true architectural construction, but it had been done with enough care that the whole thing held together. The infrastructure he thought he had seen in the distance when he landed in this cave was simply the multiple stone watchtowers growing like menhirs all around the spiral rocky cone. Ashen wooden palisades cordoned off a large area around this camp, preventing outsiders from entering. This was obviously one of these digesters' headquarters, but he didn't know which species it was. Along the way, Jake had seen goblins killing each other, orcs fighting other orcs, and sometimes even hybrid armies confronting each other. Based on his findings, each of these rocky promontories was home to a different tribe, and if his instincts weren't wrong, the passageway to the lower level. What surprised him, on the other hand, was the absence of noise. These goblin and orc digesters weren't exactly the quiet type, and they were fond of expressing their existence in the most obscene and depraved ways possible. Jake didn't know that digesters could defecate until now, but after twice avoiding stepping in silver poop, he was well aware. Sniffing the air, Jake caught the smell of blood. Not digester blood, but human blood. There was also a sweet fragrance wafting through the air. Cautiously, he left the protective edge of the forest and glided stealthily into the camp. Once he reached the palisades, Jake glanced over and saw the bloodbath he had mentally prepared for. Goblin and orc digesters' corpses everywhere. A dozen of these goblins looked like the goblin generals who had wreaked havoc on the Nawai warriors serving buzzcock, and their mounts lay beside them. Several orcs in armor like the one Jake had defeated also lay among the dead. Farther on, at the entrance to a tunnel cut into the rocky promontory, lay the huge but bloody corpse of a huge ogre-like creature. In addition to all these monsters, there were also a bunch of aliens, humans, and other colorful creatures that didn't swear by batrachian gray and silver sheen. A noteworthy element was the decrepit sapling with withered leaves that was standing near one of the huts. As expected, all the survivors were heading in the same direction. There were a fair number of fourth ordeal evolvers among them, but the odds were stacked against them. As Jake pieced together the facts, he quickly concluded that when they reached the camp, they had bumped into Ural Tak, who had made short work of them. Among the victims, Jake recognized several Shirals, but Shaktalar was not on the list. He also found several Murtharian nerds, which only darkened his mood. He did, however, identify most of Melkri's officers. Counting the corpses he had previously listed along the way, the faction leader had lost most of her forces. With the digester boss killed and no sign of Ural or his own companions, Jake decided he might as well head for the lower level. As he was about to enter this new tunnel, he smelled the sweet odor mingling with the metallic smell of blood from the other corpses again and paused. Who's there? Chapter 579, Saving a Tree. Jake didn't even have to do anything to get his answer. Besides the corpses and the tunnel entrance, there was only one thing out of place in this goblin camp. The sapling. This young tree was not very tall, about his height, and its trunk was not wider than his own neck, which all things considered was not actually that narrow. The bark was still a little green, but dull and crumbly as if the sapling was dying. Its wilted auburn leaves supported this statement. If he had any doubt, several amber sap seeped out slowly from several gaps dotting the trunk, and Jake finally found out where the sweet scent was coming from. A quick scan told him the rest. Ficrant sapling, a plant life form that has evolved to the point of awakening its own soul and subsequently forming its own humanoid avatar, the Dryad, is currently in a critical state, the tree and its spirit body having been severely damaged. Because of its severe injuries, the tree was forced to devolve into this juvenile form to survive. In the absence of proper sunlight and soil, it will soon die. Under other circumstances, Jake might have missed out, but Crunch and the orange turkey made it so it wouldn't happen. These two guys had a way of slipping out of sight in times of danger, but always reappeared when they were not needed at all. While Jake was still wondering why this sapling looked so familiar to him, Crunch had already pounced on it and was in the process of clawing at its young trunk. The orange turkey that was perched on his head had jumped onto one of the branches and had also begun to prick the trunk with its beak in the manner of a woodpecker, although this was closer to a jackhammer given the savagery of the action. "Do you hate trees that much?" Jake facepalmed as he saw the sheer relentlessness he was putting on this shrub that had done nothing to deserve it. He was about to snap at them to make them stop when the shrub suddenly came to life, its flexible trunk suddenly spinning on itself to deliver a resounding slap to the turkey perched on one of its branches. The pecking orange turkey lost his balance as the trunk gave way under his beak and then was picked off in the face by one of the few remaining leafy branches. Jake followed the turkey's parabolic flight with utter indifference, then scowled at his cat. Crunch immediately stopped clawing, but subconsciously raised one of his legs to relieve his bladder. The result was another resounding branching slap, the crack of which was akin to a whipping. To Jake's great regret, however, Crunch was too heavy and the sapling too delicate to dislodge him from his position. His steel-roughened fur took the impact like a thick, impenetrable mattress, and the black cat swaggered away once the deed done. "I've got to discipline this cat when I get back, or he's only going to cause me trouble in the future," Jake promised himself inwardly as he stared at his smug face. Paying back the orange turkey and Crunch for their disrespect had clearly not been easy for this dying tree, and it had lost what few leaves it had left during its revenge while the arm branch had snapped. Jake walked serenely to the tree, examined it from top to bottom, circling it several times, then probed calmly. "Melcree." The scan hadn't given him that information, but they were in digester territory, and there was still the possibility that the female evolver was ranked higher than him. When Jake asked his question, the sapling shivered unknowingly, unable to guess his intentions. If he decided to attack at that moment, she was dead. On the other hand, her reaction also told Jake that she was still conscious. He didn't think he could cure the damaged mind of a tree, but if Melcree was awake, it was a lot easier. Was it Ural who did this? Jake asked telepathically. A short silence followed, then a rambling, barely audible female voice echoed in his head. "Yes, he killed everyone, including my subordinates." Jake didn't need to hear the obvious. He was smart enough to come to that conclusion on his own. What he really wanted to know was, "Then, why are you still alive?" He asked bluntly. "It's not that I doubt you, but I could understand if you had run away, but you're still here. I doubt Ural didn't notice you in your condition. I want to know why he spared you." "He didn't. I had to die to convince him to leave me in peace." "What do you mean?" Jake frowned, but he had a hunch about her answer. "I'm a dryad. My real body is a tree. I let it destroy my avatar, then my real body, and consume the spirit energy powering it, and I put the rest of my strength into a seed that I didn't let germinate until after Ural was gone. Unfortunately, the seed was also damaged during the battle. Once sprouted, I thought I would be able to grow quite quickly, but this soil is barren, as is this light. I will well and truly die within a few hours if nothing is done. That's because you need ultraviolet light for your photosynthesis." Jake explained with a wide-eyed look of astonishment. "So you don't know what a tree needs to thrive?" At her silence, he could almost imagine Melcree blinking dumbly. "Light, air, and soil." She answered in a hesitant voice after a long moment. "Yeah, but no." Jake shook his head before correcting himself in a fit of pity. "I mean, yes, but your answer is at an elementary school level. To grow up, you need this and this." As he said this, Jake threw a handful of crushed rocks at the root of the tree like someone would throw seed at pigeons, while raising a palm wrapped in a bright halo toward the decrepit shrub. Rays of pure white light struck Melcree, but there was also something more in it that her plant body was craving for. Melcree was confused and gloomy at first, but as soon as she was bathed in the light, her leaves began to hum with joy as her roots greedily absorbed the minerals from the pile of fertilizer he had thrown at her. In the end, Melcree was still a fourth ordeal evolver, and her bloodline was no ordinary tree. Once the ideal growing conditions were met, the ficrant sapling began to grow rapidly, and its sap stopped flowing as the gaps closed in a matter of minutes. Seeing that her body was responding well, Jake threw in some more soil and sped up the rotation of her ether core to produce more sunlight. The growth of the sapling accelerated even more, and it soon returned to its original size. Jake didn't see what the tree looked like at first, so he assumed it was fully regenerated, but only Melkri knew it was a long way off. However, it was mature enough to generate a new avatar. The ficrant tree was suddenly enveloped in a radiant green light, and the next thing he knew, a naked woman with long, wavy pale green hair and pointed ears was lying on the ground in front of Jake in the fetal position. Jake would have gladly admired her beauty if he wasn't in such a hurry. Not knowing if she had anything to wear, he briefly considered lending her his clothes, but she was almost a meter shorter than him. Fortunately, he was worrying for nothing, and patches of bark quickly covered her body in the sensitive areas. Melkri was unaware of the concept of modesty and embarrassment, so it was clearly something she had learned to do by mimicry after discovering that it caused unpredictable and often deleterious reactions in other humans, especially those with a trunk between their legs. And his savior? Yep, no doubt, he had a trunk too. Jake had looked away to let her get dressed, but he suddenly realized something as he recalled his previous scan that he hadn't been paying attention to. Now that Melkri was in human form again, it hit him in the eye. Where is your oracle device? Even a first ordeal evolver knew how to hide his bracelet under his skin, but Jake could easily sense the presence and energy of the liquid alloy with his mental sense if the evolver in front didn't try to stop him. Earlier, Melkri was on the verge of death and her mind was functioning in slow motion, unable to operate normally. His scan, as well as his mind, should have detected her oracle device, but he hadn't noticed. That was the main reason he had almost missed the true nature of this tree in the first place. Melkri froze as she mulled over his question. Her eyes went blank as she tried to communicate with her oracle AI, and intense relief appeared on her face when she got a response. Alas, it wasn't long before she was depressed again as she read its report. So, Jake prodded her gently. A tear of sweet sap rolled down the corner of one of her eyelids for the first time, and he knew he had guessed right. It was the first time Melkri had felt overwhelmed by such a sense of loss and frustration. Finally, she took a deep breath and disclosed with her once again placid and apathetic face. I don't have an oracle device anymore except for a few milligrams of liquid alloy that I was able to save in my seed. My oracle rank is retained, but all its features are suspended until the lost liquid alloy and energy is made up. Chapter 5, 83rd floor. Jake felt bad when he saw her helplessness, but not so bad as to offer her a fraction of his precious supply of alloy liquid. Maybe if the two of them had a good relationship and he was sure he could trust her, he would have made a kind gesture, but right now it was just a futile effort to expect any altruism from him. What this made him realize, instead, was that it was in his best interest not to put all his eggs in one basket. Instead of carrying around all his liquid alloy to keep his Oris device at peak performance, he would now store the bulk of it in several places, including his oracle cabin, the faction vault, and his floating island for starters. If there was also a universal bank established in the mirror universe, or even B842, he intended to open an account there. I'm going now. Jake looked away to avoid being gripped by compassion for this total stranger. Jake did not invite Melkri to follow him. There was strength in numbers, but he already had too many problems with just a cat and a turkey in tow. Yet, there was no need to, because the young woman began to follow him on her own accord like an abandoned puppy. Jake turned his head towards her, and thank God, she was still sporting her deadpan face. If she knew how to handle human expressions to execute a tearful pout, he might have fallen for it. Fortunately for him, Melkri was just a tree originally. Her avatar was just an artificial body stripped of the instincts a human should have. At least, that was the impression he got from the young woman's behavior. The truth was that a dryad had a perfectly functional human body with some differences. After all, a tree was still a living being. Some vegan extremists might even tell you they could feel pain and other feelings, and in Melkri's case, it was true. The only nuance was that a tree did not perceive reality as a human does. To begin with, a tree was born, grew, and died in the same place. Its existence consisted of growing, flowering, giving fruit, and repeating these cycles with the seasons until it died. Melkri had been a tree for much longer than a dryad, and her character was naturally affected by this. Besides an infinite patience and quietude, she was totally detached from what was going on around her as long as she was not directly involved. The emotions she felt after losing her subordinates and her bracelet were all new to her, and she had a hard time sorting through it all. For Jake, she was factually grateful, but it couldn't be said this feeling really came from the heart. It was more of an appreciation that made her want to reciprocate. So the trio gained a new member, and following Jake, they entered the tunnel at the foot of the spiral promontory. They were plunged into darkness for a few moments, and a downward slope signaled that they were going deeper and deeper into the dungeon's depths. As Jake considered producing some light, the slope began to straighten out until it was completely flat, and a chill wind blew in their faces. With the narrowness of the tunnel, it was as if someone had left the door of a house open during a storm, and the icy air current was strong enough to sweep away objects weighing several hundred kilograms. For Jake, who weighed several tons with his liquid alloy, it was nothing, but for Melcree in her dryad form it was a different story. Light brown vines shot out of her hands in all directions and clung to the legs of Jake and Crunch. There was another one who was struggling even more than Melcree, and that was the orange turkey. Its talons and beak were firmly gripping the fur and wrinkled skin of the big black cat, pulling its skin back and lifting Crunch's face at the same time. Far from being embarrassed, the cat seemed to enjoy the massage. Jake and Crunch continued to move forward effortlessly until they emerged from the tunnel to discover a new cavern. This one was large, perhaps even larger than the last, but there was no forest or architecture blocking their view. The only thing they could see were snow dunes as far as the eye could see and a blizzard that stormed relentlessly and obstructed their vision. Without their heightened perception, they couldn't have seen more than a few feet ahead. The first thing Jake thought was that it had been much harder to find his comrades and the entrance to the lower floor. On the other hand, it also meant that he was less likely to be spotted as well. The most annoying thing, however, was that his pursuit of Ural tack ended here. Because of the blizzard, their footprints in the snow did not survive for more than a few seconds, and it was so cold that the ground was mostly icy. Unless you stomped the ground extremely hard or weighed several tons, it was impossible to leave your footprints there anyway. Meow. Yeah, I know. I don't like this place either. Jake nodded. It wasn't just because he couldn't see, but also because the cold didn't give him any advantage. Here, his passive healing skill couldn't be triggered at all. He could only rely on his vitality and constitution to recover. Moreover, his Murtharian body worked better at a higher temperature. Even though he would not suffer from a low temperature, all his physical faculties would inevitably be impacted if he let his body temperature drop too low. With this blizzard, he would have to expend considerable energy to keep his body temperature constant. With his ether core and ether sun core, or even his natural constitution, this wasn't really a problem. But it still meant that his heat spells would be a bit weaker here, and he would have less energy available to cast other spells. I don't like it here either, Melcree admitted a few seconds later as she shivered, her arms crossed around her chest for warmth. Obviously, a few patches of bark wasn't enough anymore. Jake was suddenly aware that she was barefoot. In this snow, it was a recipe for frostbite and possibly amputation. Climb on Crunch's back for now. I'll try to figure out what to do about your clothes on the way, Jake suggested with a tone that left no room for rejection. Melcree was still a little confused since her rebirth and obeyed submissively with a nod. As soon as she put her feet in the thick, warm fur of the feline, she felt better. Although it didn't look like it, Crunch was also benefiting from the Murtharian body passive and was making a decent boiler. Jake then began to move forward cautiously, even considering flying for a brief moment, figuring he had little chance of being spotted, but he gave up on that plan. Although he had the ether of luck with him, all it took was an unfortunate encounter with the wrong person or digester to seal his fate. Before he did anything crazy, he wanted to determine the level of the digesters on this floor first. Someone must have heard his wish, because it was granted much faster than he expected. After walking only a few hundred meters, the ground began to shake in front of them, and Jake saw a gigantic bulge appear under one of the snow dunes, cracking the ice as it passed. This bulge was moving under the snow and was a good 10 meters wide, lifting the snow above it by several meters as it passed. Jake squinted his eyes, calmly staring at the entity without daring to breathe, but when he confirmed that this subterranean thing was heading towards them, he abandoned all discretion. Prepare for battle. As soon as Jake put his comrades on guard, the bulge under the snow suddenly sped up, hurtling toward them like an underwater torpedo. Crunch inhaled a ton of air and ruffled his fur into his defensive pufferfish form and stuck his tail into the ground to use his body as a flail. The orange turkey flapped its wings in panic to get as high in the air as possible, but with the blizzard in full swing, it was a tall order. Melcree was still recovering and was far from her full fighting potential, but she was still a fourth ordeal evolver. Bark covered her entire body until it formed a kind of natural armor. Branches, then triangular auburn leaves grew from her back and head, quickly giving her the appearance of a small ent or treant. Jake knew that the group was counting on him for this confrontation, but he was a little confused. His earth control allowed him to easily perceive movements and vibrations in the earth, but it could do nothing about snow. This thing under the snow was moving above the ground, and he could only use his other senses to follow its movements. Preparing for the worst, he fired a few air bullets, those compressed and accelerated by his telekinesis. His telekinesis skill could generate a force equivalent to twice his real strength, to which was added that of his spirit body, which in addition to its level was also 12 times greater than a normal spirit. When a force more than 20 times greater than his maximum physical strength was focused on a very small object, the power generated was simply stupendous. Jake could not defend himself against his own spell, and logically, neither could his enemies. The bullets hit the snow with teleportation-like speed, and geysers of snow shot high into the sky, producing large bangs. For a moment, the snow mass collapsed. The dune became smooth again, but a few seconds later the bulge started moving towards him again with even greater speed. His air bullets had failed to kill their target. Chapter 581 Fear. Did I miss it? Jake couldn't believe it. Those were some of the fastest air bullets he had ever fired. If this creature moving under snow could avoid that, then his other techniques had no better chance of succeeding unless he took it up a notch. In this blizzard that was sapping his stamina, that was the very scenario he wanted to avoid. From a fifth ordeal evolver, or even a talented fourth ordeal evolver, Jake could accept his failure, but not from a rank 4 or 5 digester. It was too soon to meet a dungeon boss. They had only just arrived. Instead of losing his temper, Jake activated his Murtharian sight and focused intently on the ether signature emitting from beneath that snowy bulge. As soon as his pupils caught the ether aura's fluctuations under the snow, he felt a deep sense of relief. That immediately makes more sense. He chuckled sinisterly. Inwardly, he thought, "You deserve to die for scaring the shit out of me and making me doubt myself." Whatever this creature was, it was slow. Maybe not for a normal refugee, but for him, it was painfully obvious. Its ether levels were in line with its predictions. It was a rank 5 digester. Rank 5 digesters had, assuming their stats were balanced, ether stats around 400 points. Based on what he saw, this one was a variant, having chosen to highly specialize in one specific stat, Constitution. And how did he know that? Simply because his air bullets had hit the mark. Despite the velocity and penetration potential of his wind bullets, it wasn't enough to take down the creature. With his Murtharian eyes, Jake had a rough outline of its morphology in mind, and he could already tell that this thing was a bit of a shell type. Where his air bullets had struck, he could discern a trail of light coming off of it and blending into the snow much like the tail of a comet. If it was ether he was seeing, then he could already surmise that it was digester blood. However, the bleeding didn't last long, and about 2 seconds later, the light discharge stopped and the creature's ether signature returned to normal. If this is not enough, let's see if you can take this. Admiring his creepy face, Crunch, Melcree and the turkey looked at him with a somewhat uneasy expression, but refused to join in at the risk of spoiling his fun. For Melcree, it was also an opportunity to see what this faction leader was capable of. This time Jake took his time aiming, coolly monitoring the creature's movements like a predator on the prowl. He crossed his arms out in front of him, his palms facing each other, one down, the other facing the sky, and the air a dozen meters around him abruptly converged on him to form an almost solid ball of air in his hands. Anyone standing too close to him at that moment would have started to suffocate, and Jake himself was holding his breath. As he channeled his telekinesis and mental strength into his hands, his palms slowly began to press together, and the ball of air became thinner and flatter until it resembled a disc. Meanwhile, the foe under the snow was still barreling toward him, unaware of the doom that lay ahead. Then, when he was ready, Jake uncrossed his hands in one swift sweep, his palms brushing against each other but never touching. A shrill, low thunder-like sound was heard, but was immediately muffled as an extremely thin, but almost solid, compressed blade of air stretched out in front of him like a silk ribbon until it reached a good 2 meters, then 5, and finally almost 10. "It should be enough," he muttered in a satisfied tone. Jake didn't shoot immediately, choosing instead to wait patiently for the monster to get as close as possible in case it had hidden its game. The bulge beneath the snow became more and more impressive as the digester drew closer, almost forming a small hill, and he began to seriously wonder if this airblade would be enough. "Don't doubt yourself, it's just a rank 5 digester," she snarled sternly, which immediately put his mind at ease. When the snowy bulge finally broke through the snow less than a meter away, Jake concentrated harder than ever as the wind blade in front of him began to whir at an extreme frequency. Several grayish filaments of sharpening ether oozed out of his ether core under the effect of ether conversion, and the sharpness of this already formidable airblade was multiplied by almost 2 in an instant. Because of the increased ether density, the effectiveness of the gray ether had weakened, but it was still a decisive asset in crucial moments like this. Broush! A huge, nightmare-inducing head suddenly popped out of the ground as Jake was beginning to lose patience. A wide-open maw ringed by thousands of long, sharp, inward-pointing teeth voraciously tried to engulf him as the thick layer of icy snow shattered into pieces to make way for the monster. Jake was ready. He had seen the inside of its mouth. He didn't want to know the rest. The airblade was released. There was no sound on impact, just silence. The blade of air passed horizontally through the monster's mouth, then its head and the rest of its body buried under the snow before continuing its way towards the dungeon's depths until it exhausted all its inertia. BRRRM. The deafening rumble that followed was only the landslide, or rather snowslide, that broke the stillness as the 2 perfectly identical severed halves of the monster crashed into the dune. At the same time, the airblade, pursuing its course, rent the sea of snow asunder, causing a residual void, which absolutely had to be filled. It was the subsequent avalanche that caused most of the commotion. "You were right, I probably overestimated that monster." Jake apologized sheepishly, while scratching his chin with his index finger. Next time, an airblade a tenth as powerful would be more than enough for the task. In the end, this thing was really just a rank 5 digester. When the snowslide stopped, Jake and the others finally had a chance to see what the monstrosity he had just slayed really looked like. It was a hideous alien, but of colossal proportions. It was hard to tell if it was a giant worm or a fish, but what was certain was that its spherical, tooth-filled jaw was distinctly reminiscent of a lamprey. The creature was obviously blind and had no visible appendages or external sensory organs to suggest that this thing was capable of orienting itself under the snow. Compared to its enormous body of a good 50 meters, its multiple pairs of fins were ridiculously small, almost atrophied. Based on his common sense, and even taking into account its hypothetical ether stats, Jake refused to believe that these were enough to move such a mass. At that moment, he became aware of the ring structure of the monster's muscles, noticing that its long body was separated into hundreds of segments. He then remembered that the worms moved with a peristaltic movement by contracting these muscles, and the rest made sense. He also found large amounts of snow in its digestive system, filling the tract up to its anus. The monster's tail resembled that of a whale, and he figured the creature was probably using a combination of all its assets to move through the snow at a decent speed. On its surface, the entire body was covered with the thickest layer of silver chitin he had ever seen. Compared to higher-ranked digesters, the quality was much lower, but this creature made up for it in sheer quantity. It was a terrifying abomination, but alas, from Jake's perspective, this thing was a failure, or at least an evolutionary dead end. Aside from its cruelly specific adaptation to this snowy environment that was not so easy to find, any reasonably experienced evolver had a chance to outrun it. In fact, with the right military weaponry, It was even possible to hunt this monster using only normal humans. As long as the weapon used was accurate and powerful enough, drilling through the chitin of this digester was no challenge. There was one thing Jake had underestimated, however, and that was the smell. That kind of stench could restore a COVID patient's nose, and that was definitely not a compliment. Still, Jake searched the corpse assiduously in hopes of finding a valuable ether skill, or better yet, an ether equipment. No luck. Besides stinking, this digester gave him nothing. Jake took the opportunity to refill his digester blood canteens, and the group set off again. Staring at his broad back, brimming with confidence and masculinity, Melcree felt something strange, but her usual apathy soon took over. So strong. That feeling that had nagged at her fleetingly before disappearing was neither love nor admiration. It was fear. Chapter 582 Hunting Snowworms. With his first victory over the towering, but painfully slow and over-specialized digester, Jake continued to battle the monsters that he and she had naturally nicknamed the snowworms. After watching him fight alone a few times, Crunch also began to participate. This was not a good environment for Melcree, who was still very weak, and she stayed on the sidelines, snuggled up in the cat's warm fur or near Jake to enjoy a free UV session. When the black cat took the initiative to fight, Jake was taken aback, but he didn't refuse and took the opportunity to assess his abilities. He was used to seeing Mufasa and Shere Khan compete, but the other cats had always given him the feel of being a force to be reckoned with, albeit several leagues below their two leaders. This was his chance to find out clearly what his cat was capable of. The oracle status of his cat was as follows. Weight, 2,600 kilograms. Ether stats, 400, Charisma, 1,000, Charm, 1,000. Body stats, S, 400, A, 300, C, 400, V, 100, I, 32, P, 600. Spirit body level 8. Skills, Feline Bewitching LVL 2, Hardening LVL 1. Body enhancements, Rubber Flesh, Living Fur. This obviously did not include the Murtharian body passive, which provided a 240% bonus to his body stats. Given his size, his cat had decent body agility and had found a good compromise between power and speed. Jake had already inspected his cat's status not so long ago, but he had been especially sickened by his feline bewitching ether spell capable of seducing felines of the opposite sex against their will. Like the other felines in the pack, Crunch had no bloodline, but he was making up for it with specific physical adaptations that he must have obtained in his previous ordeals. The hardening skill was new, but it was one of the most affordable ether spells in the Oracle store. He must have bought it before they left, or maybe even in the Oracle shelter where Buzzcock was holed up before everything went to hell. It was a real eye-opener for Jake because it told him that Crunch wasn't as stupid and shallow as he looked. Hardening was a useful and versatile skill that could be used for both attacking and defending, and was not likely to become obsolete as time passed. Jake himself had better acquire this skill as soon as possible, as well as the rest of his group. Facing his first snowworm, Crunch first tried to coax it with his innate charisma and charm. An overpowered, overlapping, echoing funnel meow swept across the space in front of him, shaking the thick blanket of snow and even causing an avalanche to break out. The armored worm slowed down drastically for a brief moment, even spinning in circles several times as if disoriented. Jets of snow split the ice, several dunes collapsing while a dorsal fin or whale tail here and there pierced the surface before diving back down immediately after. It was as if the digester was in intense pain or inner dilemma and was trying with all his might to resist it. Unfortunately, as soon as the meowing stopped, the titanic beast stopped thrashing around chaotically and resumed darting towards the culprit. Crunch, who had gotten jumpy, gulped and took 2 steps backwards until he felt his master's gentle hand on his head. "I'm here. Just show me what you've got." Jake encouraged him with a reassuring smile. Crunch wagged his tail happily and planted his long tail in the ground as his body swelled like a globe fish again after a deep breath. Now that Jake knew his skills and stats, he knew what to expect. Once his fur hardened and bristled, Crunch became the striking head of a flail, his tail the flexible and extensible rope, while the part rooted in the ground became the handle. With his body control, an attribute resulting from his agility, perception, and intelligence. He could then control his tail at will to generate the greatest amount of centrifugal energy. As soon as Crunch's tail began to spin around its anchor point, an ominous wind swirled around it, almost triggering its own mini blizzard. Seeing the Scourge's head spinning dangerously above him at increasingly insane speeds, Jake nervously stepped back in turn, leaving Crunch alone in his bubble to face the snowworm. Like Jake against his first worm, the cat had also overestimated his opponent. When the snowy bulge came in front of him, Crunch was spinning so fast and had gained so much kinetic energy that the tip of his tail was slowly beginning to unscrew. His extendable tail had grown several meters longer due to the centrifugal force and looked as if it might snap off at any moment. In fact, Crunch was already feeling a bit dizzy. Because of this, he had nearly forgotten about the snowworm that was about to devour him, and when the jaw full of sharp teeth opened wide to swallow him whole, what was bound to happen happened. Bang! A sphere weighing 2.5 tons and covered with long, bristly hair as hard as diamonds smashed sideways the wide, open mouth of the monster with the inertia of a speeding Boeing. Hundreds of broken fangs flew along with quite a few black hairs, but most shocking was the shattered chitin exoskeleton that flew in all directions. The snowworm's brain, which was already not that big, was violently shaken in its cranial box and imploded at once, when hundreds of long, sharp black hairs pierced it at the same time. It was the result of living fur. Crunch was able to control, extend, and even pull out his hair to attack or perform all sorts of feats upon impact. Because of its sheer weight, the monster didn't soar through the sky, and the lower half of its body remained buried under the snow. However, by the time its disfigured and bloody mouth collapsed onto the icy dune where Crunch was standing, the digester was as good as dead. Nice job, Crunch, and I mean it. Jake gave him an appreciative thumbs up as he admired the result. He clearly didn't want to be the guy on the receiving end of that hit. Instead of prancing proudly around after receiving a praise from his master for his overwhelming victory, Crunch released his breath suddenly, and his tail about to leave the ground lost its anchor, and he deflated in the air, propelled in all directions like a leaky balloon. For a creature of almost 3 tons with no wings, it was almost as spectacular as the previous attack. If there was another one that was incapable of strutting about, it was the orange turkey. He had made the mistake of staying nestled in the cat's fur, and even though he had gotten out in time, he was now paying the price for his laziness, vomiting his last meal on the sidelines. The only one who was doing well was Melcree, but she was feeling cold again. Once Crunch was back on his feet and brimming with confidence, the group set off again, and Jake and his cat set about slaughtering the snowworms with increasing efficiency. To this duo, these huge armored worms were nothing more than prey yielding plenty of ether and experience. In 2 hours, Jake and Crunch killed almost 100 of them, and for the first time Jake began to reap the benefits of this winning streak. These snowworms, though slow and limited, had one redeeming quality, and that was their size. With equal ether stats, their massive bodies contained significantly more ether than other smaller digesters. On top of that, their stats were heavily biased towards strength and constitution, and the impact on their stats was inevitably felt. During those 2 hours, Jake's ether strength and constitution went from 1,000 or so to over 1,200. It may not seem like much, but each point was harder to earn than the last, and these digesters were only rank 5. Compared to the hundreds of goblin and orc digesters on the previous floor that had only given him a few points, the choice was quickly made. Melcree and the orange turkey watched them fight with an envious look on their faces, but what could they do? Was it their fault that they were too weak to participate? For Melcree especially, it was terribly frustrating, but she was basically a tree, and it would never have occurred to her that one day she might feel jealous for not having to risk her life. All she could do was focus on healing her tree body to mature it back to its previous form. Even though her new sapling was intact, she had lost her entire body and a good chunk of her spirit to Ural. It was only because she could be reborn into a seed that she was still alive. Jake in her situation would be dead, or his damaged soul would be lingering somewhere in the dungeon, unable to restore the lost memories. Even if somehow he had kept his soul intact, without any unscathed cells from his original body, he would have been left with only possession to find a new body for himself. Jake and Crunch fought for another hour after that, and the snowworms grew stronger and stronger, their ether levels slowly approaching those of a rank 6 digester. Rank 6 digesters had ether stats around 1,000, which was the standard for a 4th ordeal evolver. At this point, even Crunch began to struggle to defeat his opponents, and Jake surprised himself by having to use air blades with a power level nearing that of the one used to defeat his first snowworm. Still, Jake was thrilled. It meant they were on the right track. Chapter 583 Decent Weapon. Holy shit, this blizzard will never end. The orange turkey gurgled in outrage, his beady black eyes bulging with anger. Of course, no one could understand the unintelligible gurgles spewing from his beak, but even without reading his ether fluctuations or using telepathy, it was obvious what he was trying to communicate, because they all agreed with him. Aside from Crunch, whose fur was suited to the coldest of climates, the others were beginning to dislike this place and its harsh weather even more. Besides the invariable landscape being an endless succession of identical snow dunes, the visibility was awful because of the blizzard blowing constantly, and they had to be careful not to be swallowed alive by a snowworm buried too close. Until now, Jake had always detected these digesters in time, but mainly because they hadn't really tried to hide. The snowy bulges accompanying their movements made them easy to track, but at least they had to come from far enough away. What would happen if one of these monsters were sleeping under their feet? This scenario had happened several times before. Jake could pick up several large presences resting beneath them, but because they were walking silently, these snowworms hadn't spotted them. Whenever he had any doubt, he would use his telekinesis to levitate them to the next dune. So far, these evasive maneuvers had been successful, but in the last few minutes the blizzard had grown fiercer and the temperature had dropped sharply. Now Jake had to deal with hailstones the size of golf balls as fast as a bullet. The barely smaller snowflakes were almost as hard, and the snow around them was now completely icy. Is it because we are getting closer to the goal? Crunch meowed as he chewed on one of the hailstones. It better be, because I'm not going to last much longer. Melcree shivered, not hiding her deep-seated sense of insecurity. As a dryad, and even more so as a tree, she had never been in such a precarious situation. All she wanted now was to become a tree again in her native forest and forget everything else. The caress of the sun, the rain, and a lush fertilizer wrapping her roots. In retrospect, it was not all that bad. At least it was a carefree life, and she didn't have to deal with all these emotions that made her unstable and miserable. We're almost there, Jake said serenely, shaking her out of her nostalgic replay. For a while now, his body had been shining like a beacon in the night, producing the light and warmth that Melcree and the turkey needed to stay alive. Currently, he was walking ahead of the group, the warm aura surrounding him melting the hailstones before they could reach them. The problem was that these hailstones were not normal ice. Although it felt just a little chilly from Jake's perspective, his oracle device was adamant. The outside temperature was 80 degrees Celsius by the current ether density standard of 64. The temperature felt, because of the blizzard blowing at several hundred miles per hour, was close to 150 degrees Celsius. On Earth, this would have been an apocalyptic weather capable of decimating all life forms on Earth or close to that. But with their abilities, they were able to survive with tremendous efforts, but not for long. I see something. Crunch meowed as he squinted his eyes. That's why I said we were almost there. Jake smiled. Because I wasn't sure what it was, I didn't want to disappoint you. What Jake and his cat saw, Melcree and the orange turkey also saw moments later. It was a faint orange glow, almost indistinguishable in the blizzard. If Jake believed his eyes and his instincts, someone had started a campfire. It wasn't that Jake hadn't considered that option, but where would he have lit it? Other than these snowy dunes, there was nothing. He could have built an igloo, but Jake had noticed that the snowworms never left them alone for long. Besides, the one time he had used his flames to attack, 2 of those digesters had come back within seconds. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but Jake had stuck to his air blades after that. Melcree had been off Crunch's back for a while now, preferring to walk behind Jake. At some point, she realized that the light radiating from him warmed her more than the big cat's soaked fur. Because of the hailstones and flakes constantly hitting her fur, they had accumulated on the feline's back, and because of his internal heat, these had quickly melted, soaking the cat's fur. Since the blizzard had intensified, This water had started to freeze and stalactites were quickly forming along his fur. Crunch was aware of this, and once in a while he would shake his fur to get rid of it, but it would refreeze immediately after. Tired of it, he gave up, leaving his fur like that, much to the turkey's disappointment. This was precisely the reason why he was gobbling angrily to himself a few minutes earlier. Tack! Suddenly, Melcree tripped over something, drawing the attention of the whole group to her. At first she thought it was exhaustion and cold that caused her to stumble, until she discovered what her foot had just hit. Shactler, she muttered impassively before shaking her head. No, it's just another Shirl. Jake came to her side in an instant and brushed off the snow in front of her with a swipe of his hand. Seeing that the snow was too hard, he breathed a stream of flame onto the thing Melcree had bumped into, revealing what lay beneath. It was an alien head, 2 ivory tusks about a meter long protruding out of the mouth and huge elephant ears spread out on either side of the skull. This evolver's trunk had been sliced clean off, and its eyes were glassy, reminiscent of Ural's other victims. When Melcree explained to him that the Shirls placed their oracle device around their trunks, he got a better understanding of what had just happened. So in the end, we were not alone here. Jake sighed. The visibility was so bad that they hadn't run into anyone but these snowworms, but he now had proof that other evolvers had made it here. Alas, they had run into Ural on the way. The circumstances were very similar to the digester camp on the previous floor. There, too, the survivors had gathered to confront the digester boss, unaware that the very enemy they had to be wary of was actually on their side. If Jake's hypothesis was correct, he was no longer in such a hurry to meet the maker of this campfire. Just to be on the safe side, the group searched the area for other victims, and they managed to dig up a bunch. Dozens of Shirls working for Shactler, as well as numerous beasts adapted to the winter climate. Shactler had shown his talent for ice magic, and these Shirls should have excelled in this environment, but in the end they had been wiped out by a single black orc. However, their leader was not among those corpses. Jake was relieved to find no Murtharian nerds among the dead. It would seem that most of them had good survival instincts and had confined themselves to an area suitable for their level. This was not surprising from former cowards. But I couldn't find any trace of Kyle, Will, Grash, or Svara. Where are you guys? Melcree offered to retrieve the bodies, but Jake replied that he had no more room in his space storage or faction vault, which was partly true. As a compromise, he incinerated them, but kept their equipment. It was the only consolation prize for playing scavenger after Ural. The Black Orc would rob them of their souls and bracelets every time, but he didn't care about the rest. Unfortunately, there was a logical explanation for this. Their equipment was tailored to their body type, and few humans were able to wear them. Some were digester drops. This made him realize that these drops were not completely random and that the dungeon could adjust its rewards to encourage the winners. These snowworms didn't drop anything. Crunch grated, brooding as he walked. Jake wasn't happy either. After all their efforts and having his luck ether, they should have at least gotten some kind of reward. I think these digesters were more of a failure than we thought. She gave her opinion. This dungeon digester is still young. So far it has only copied the anatomy and ability of the present evolvers. There must have been 1 or 2 creatures similar to these snowworms in the horde of beasts, and he attempted a fusion. If I'm right, these beasts had no ether skills, and given their size, no relevant items could come out of it. It's also likely that due to its immaturity, the dungeon digester is not yet creative enough to produce proper rewards. In short, did we come too early? It's like an amusement park. Never come at the opening day. You can look at it that way. Still, among the Shirl's equipment, there were a few useful pieces, namely their weapons. Despite their large size and weight, they were perfectly usable. There were 2 inferior ether artifacts and 1 intermediate ether artifact, namely a mage staff, an enchanted revolver, and a digester saber. Jake now had a decent weapon. Chapter 580 for the Survivor. Intermediate ether artifact. Bone-crushing snowworm's fong. The tooth of a rank 7 elite snowworm transmuted into a saber upon its death. In addition to its extreme natural hardness, which allows it to crush ice and rock in its path, its cutting edge does not erode and can withstand chewing forces of several thousand tons. Weight, 650 kilograms. Attributes, strength, +5%, Constitution, plus 5%. Passive skill, repairs itself as long as the base, handle, remains intact. This saber had a very long, broad, barbed crystalline blade, held by a grip wrapped in ordinary, silvery skin. Its length exceeded 2 meters and approached the dimensions of a spear. With its sharp, dual-edged blade, this weapon would slice, dice, stab, and jab his enemies and shred whatever's left of them. The blade also had a spiked, slightly curved crossguard, which made sure the blade was both balanced and capable of protecting the owner's hands against any sliding sword. As for the handle, the design was functional and sleek, designed entirely for combat. For the finishing touch, a fairly large silver chitin pommel finished off the end of the grip, even serving as a stunner. Awesome. This digestive saber was good. Jake thought these snowworms were incapable of dropping anything worthwhile, but he was wrong. They just hadn't been lucky enough to run into an elite. The orc who had donated the helmet to him was the same, and it was clear that they were not too common in this dungeon. If so, what kind of rewards can these floor bosses bestow? Jake wondered with a longing gaze. You chose to track down Ural to avoid unnecessary confrontations. If you want to fight a digester boss, you'll have to choose another path. She reminded him sternly. Although if you ask me, he'll never reach the Nexus. This dungeon digester might be young, but each of these floors is vast and structured. Seeing how those rank 9 and 10 digesters obeyed him, I'm afraid those high-ranked evolvers overestimated their abilities. Then, should I choose another road? Jake paused, staring at his brand-new sword. He was ambitious and sometimes a little too greedy, but he could still recognize a lousy plan when he saw one. At first it had seemed as good a plan as any to follow Ural on the sly, but as he delved deeper he began to realize that this dungeon digester wasn't so simple. Between the second and third floors where his group was, the average ether levels of these digesters had gone from 6400 to 400, 1500. This was the difference between rank 4-5 and 5-6 digesters, and did not include the digester bosses that Jake had never faced. The second floor was the perfect playground for second and third ordeal evolvers, and even civilians without any ordeals under their belts had a fair shot by staying in the forest's periphery. The weather was mild, and the digesters one encountered there were often stupid, primitive, and lost. While they were not immune to encountering a Tautai digester, an orc elite, or an organized squad, they could usually be heard coming from quite a distance. The third floor was different. For starters, the climate was harsh. Too harsh. Without the right bloodline, equipment, or skill set, this environment could even take out a fourth ordeal evolver. Melkree was a clear example of this. If the orange turkey had been left to fend for itself, it would have been an ice statue in less than 2 minutes, maybe 10 with the Murtharian body passive. Second, the snowworms, despite their flaws, were huge armored creatures impervious to ordinary missiles and ether spells. Not every fourth ordeal evolver had in their arsenal what it took to hunt one of these monsters. Following this logic, the next floor promised to be even more dangerous and would house rank 7 digesters and perhaps even rank 8s regarding elites or bosses. She had already warned him about this, and Jake was already feeling some trepidation. Average rank 7 digesters had average ether stats hovering around 2,000 points, but rank 8 digesters were inching closer to 10,000. That was quite a jump in power, which would be difficult to compensate for with his body stats and other skills. This was beyond the standard of a 5th ordeal evolver that Jake placed at 5,000 points. Again, this was assuming that these 5th ordeal evolvers had somehow managed to improve all their ether stats to the same level. This was far from guaranteed. If an evolver could accomplish that feat, that was already pretty good. Okay, I decided. I'll take a look at the next floor, but I'm not following Ural anymore. Jake stated aloud, as if to better convince himself that this was the right decision. What? You were planning to follow that crazy orc who almost killed us all? Crunch hissed as he ruffled all his hair in fright, which shattered the accumulated stalactites on his back. Idiot, you've been with me the whole time, and you didn't realize it? Jake rolled his eyes as he saw his cat's comical reaction. Melkree didn't say anything, but her brow nodded with concern spoke volumes about what she thought of his previous plan. Why was it that those who didn't want to run into Ural had all run into him, while this human who was stalking him of his own free will had been completely ignored? Life was unfair. Because I'm good, Jake calmly boasted as he poked his thumb at his chest. From her expression and what she had been through, it wasn't hard to guess what was going through her mind. The group then set off again, and like the previous time, Jake cremated the bodies to spare them the fate of ending up as nutrients for the dungeon or one of those snowworms. The orange glow they had seen in the blizzard was not far away, and they reached it a few moments later. As they had anticipated, it was a campfire, and there was someone leaning against it. Unlike the other snow-covered dunes, this one clearly had a rocky base, making it a genuine hill, and the side was hollowed out, opening into a spacious cave. The glow came from inside. Jake and his group went in without hesitation, but only after scanning the surroundings. Even if the scan didn't work well in the dungeon, it was only if there were obstacles interfering with spiritual energy like the dungeon walls or strong enough digesters, whether plant or animal-based. Only one person, and his ether fluctuations are just slightly above ours. We should be fine. If there's any trouble, we can always run away. Jake warned them in a whisper. Melcree, Crunch, and the orange turkey nodded seriously and tiptoed behind him. Jake, on the other hand, made no attempt to hide his presence. If the evolver present had any survival instincts at all, it would have spotted them as soon as it sensed their oracle scan. When Jake and Melcree found out who the evolver inside was, they were dumbstruck. Shactler. Shirl was in bad shape. He was still alive, but his lavish aquamarine robe embroidered with gold clouds, lace and frills had burned away, revealing his thick gray, parchment-like skin beneath. The ice mage was covered in festering wounds and burns, and was missing his left leg cut off at the thigh, and his right arm blown off along with a portion of his torso and one of his lungs. His scholarly elephant face was no better off. In addition to the swelling, his ivory tusks had been ripped from his mouth, while deep scars plowing through his skull had nearly gouged out his brain. But what was most shocking was the reaction Shactler had when he saw them. When his deadened gaze landed on Jake, his once vile and shifty eyes bulged with pure terror, and his body began to shake like a leaf. Devil. Leave me alone. I don't want to die. Despite his severe injuries, Shactler immediately materialized his magic wand and pointed it straight at them. Noticing that Jake was the target, Crunch and the others quickly moved away from him and left him to bear the spell alone. A radiant blue light briefly blinded him, forcing him to shield his eyes with his arm, and the next thing he knew, ice spears were springing from the floor, walls, and ceiling of the cave around him with the intent of skewering him. With a swipe of his hand, a wind blade shattered half of them, while a heat blast suddenly burst forth from his body, vaporizing the rest. Yet, there was a different ice spear from the others hidden in the middle of these feints. A faint cobalt blue radiance shimmered inside, and its velocity was at least 10 times faster and comparable to his air blades. Jake couldn't dodge his own spells at close range, but that didn't mean he didn't have countermeasures in place. When this ice spear was about to impale him, he disappeared, and it went into the stone wall behind. Jake reappeared immediately afterwards in front of Shactler and delivered a heavy uppercut to his stomach, which made him vomit what was left of his bile. Already at the end of his rope, Shirl let himself be grabbed by the neck, and his head was smashed into the nearest wall, his teeth plowing its surface for several meters until his torturer finally decided to let him go. Having lost the last of his teeth and his jaw broken, Jake wiped his hands with a satisfied smile and smiled sadistically. Now I assume I have the right to know what I did to deserve this attack, don't I? Chapter 585A Devil. Far from getting the cooperation he had hoped for, Shactler, who was still as tormented and deranged as ever, let out a gut-wrenching howl, and ice stalactites suddenly sprang from his body, sealing the mage under a thick layer of ice covered with frozen spikes. Am I really that scary? Jake muttered as he nervously scratched his chin in genuine puzzlement. Crunch, Melcree, and the orange turkey nodded with perfect synchronicity. Then, should I kill him for good? Jake raised the question aloud to himself and the others. As terrified and harmless as he was at the moment, he hadn't forgotten what kind of scum Shactler was. His reputation as a racist, cruel, sociopathic aristocrat preceded him, and he had not hesitated to enslave men, women, and children of any species other than his own to finance the development of his faction. Shirl may not have been a lecherous, stupid barbarian like Buzzcock, but in some ways he was far worse. At least the Nawai leader was partially driven by his impulses and traditions, while Shaktalar had the poise and brains to behave differently. Jake thought at first that Shaktalar was just a speciesist and only acted that way with other people, but he had seen many Shirls among the refugees, many of them serving in the Red District. Their lives were miserable and indecent, with a surprisingly high death rate from infections and other transmittable diseases. What these enslaved pachyderm aliens had in common was that they were poor commoners, often with physiques more puny and ungainly than those in Shaktalar's faction. In Oraclean, his faction was called Blue Blood, and that spoke volumes about his ambitions and convictions. Killing this kind of individual would not be a big loss for anyone. If you force him to sign a slave contract, you will, by extension, get back all the slave contracts in his possession. Melkree timidly suggested as she observed the huge pitted block of ice that Shaktalar had walled himself in. We can also kill him, and it will amount to the same thing. Wasn't that what we intended to do with Buzzcock? Crunch meowed mischievously as he pretended to slit his throat with one of his claws. To be honest, I've never tasted elephant meat. I don't mind telling you that I'm a little excited, the cat added, smacking his lips. The turkey gobbled excitedly as he flapped his wings frantically to support his buddy's suggestion. Within hours, they were already thick as thieves, as if they had known each other for years. Jake probed his second conscience opinion as a matter of principle before making his decision. Honestly, he didn't give a damn about Shaktalar's fate. Whether he lived or died, Jake reasoned more in terms of benefit/disadvantage ratios. The truth was that he was more inclined to save him at the moment. Force him to sign the contract. She supported his inner desire, as she often did. To begin with, this will allow you to interrogate him without him disobeying. Given his position, he should know a lot of things you don't. Besides, even if he's in bad shape, he's still a fourth ordeal evolver. One more ally in this dungeon can't hurt. We think alike. If you weren't in my head, I would have married you. Jake smiled delightedly before realizing what he had just said. Forget what I said. She didn't speak again after that, but Jake was too embarrassed to apologize. Now that he had his Oracle AI's blessing, he complied immediately. Shaktalar, get the fuck out. Jake growled ominously as he landed a crushing punch in the ice block, shattering a few stalactites in the process. A casual punch from Jake could deliver a force of over 150 tons. The ice sphere in which Shaktalar had imprisoned himself was no match for him. Under the impact, it was smashed off, the ice block ricocheting 5 or 6 times against the walls of the cave before losing its inertia. Shirl's eyes bulged with terror as he anxiously stared at the rapidly spreading cracks in the ice, while he held on tightly to his magic wand to maintain the spell. It was a waste of time. Once Jake warmed up, he went in with his hands and feet, savagely pounding the ice sphere like a punching bag. After 7 or 8 blows, the ice prison exploded and a nauseated and dazed Shaktalar toppled before his feet. I'm not sure this kind of ally is going to help us much in this dungeon. Jake was more than a little wary as he stared at the alien's haggard, desperate face. For a faction leader, he was a sight to behold. All the more reason to question him. She replied aggressively. If he's that weak, getting him to sign the contract will be a piece of cake. At least she was still willing to talk to him. Jake consoled himself inwardly as he listened to her admonition. Their time was running out, so he grabbed Shaktalar by the collar and pressed his bracelet against his. Shaktalar's Akal, Shirl. Mental state, traumatized. Soul whole, but fragmented. Ether storage, 712 points. It should indeed be easy. Jake understood the alien's behavior better. He still had his soul, but it had suffered heavy damage. What was most shocking was how poor he was. He had finally realized that billionaires like him were not that common among low-rank evolvers. Even with thousands of people under his command, his fortune was less than what Jake was passively earning with his purgatory in a day. Now that he was a little less ignorant about the topic, he knew that rank 7 digesters were a threat to 4th ordeal evolvers, while rank 8 outperformed most 5th ordeal evolvers. A rank 7 yielded about 750 ether points, and 3,500 for a rank 8. Even selling blood and bodies, it was difficult to accumulate a considerable fortune in such a short time. To get that rich, The Aristocats had to be terribly efficient, and that was only possible because of Mufasa and Shere Khan. To make matters worse, Shaktler had an entire faction to manage, and unlike Buzzcock, he was not selfish, and in fact was quite profligate. As long as his subordinates were Shirals and part of the aristocracy, they were entitled to the best treatment. Jake regretted that the Oracle system didn't allow him to force defeated prisoners to sign a slave contract. But on the other hand, it was a good thing if he was ever in the same position. Shaktler had to be willing. Good thing they were not in the Oracle shelter. Mind control, torture, and other brainwashing methods were totally acceptable. Pretending to look at the time on his non-existent watch, Jake exhaled with little enthusiasm. No choice. Someone has to do it. Aergurk. A few soul arrows here, a few spiritual eye beams there. The result was soon felt. The Shaktler's roars of pain covered the noise of the blizzard, and Jake quickly got the hang of it. Zienzalver's soul stone had many soul spells and documentation on the subject, and Jake was a talented student. A few minutes later, Shaktler had his empty gaze locked in his like a zombie, drooling and arms hanging down. The good thing was that he wasn't screaming anymore. At that moment, Jake had moved the torture session into his head, and Shaktler was trapped in his own mind, trapped in a nightmarish illusion. As he was slowly skinned alive, then regenerated to start the process over and over again, only a few minutes had passed outside. With his mental stats and his soul power, Jake could easily change the time ratio to 1 to 50 or 60. Between each torture, an illusion of Jake would appear to heal him and whisper sweetly in his ear that all he had to do was sign the slave contract and his torment would end. He also dangled incredible rewards and privileges in the form of billions of ether points, thousands of ether skills, and several grade 10 and higher bloodlines. Jake had to admit that Shaktler had a strong will. He may have been a racist and a speciesist, but his beliefs were firmly anchored in his mind. Despite the ravages his soul had suffered, he was still able to subconsciously resist his brainwashing. Jake didn't know if it was the terror it evoked in him or sheer determination that allowed him to resist for so long, but it was all to his credit. Eventually, though, minutes became hours and Shaktler gave in. "I'm willing," Shiral rasped out with a cough. He had already coughed up so much blood in this illusion that he barely had the strength to whisper. "What? I didn't quite hear." Jake repeated mockingly, turning a deaf ear. "I'm willing. Damn it, I'll sign it. I'll sign this fucking contract." Okay. You should have said that earlier." Jake laughed and patted his shoulder as if they were old friends. Then he placed the slave contract in front of his eyes, and Shaktler received the notification. He sighed regretfully and agreed to make a pact with the devil. The next moment, the illusion disappeared and the cave reappeared before his eyes, along with a Melkri, a cat, and a turkey wearing bewildered expressions. The devil who was responsible for his injuries and this endless nightmare was also in front of his eyes, staring at him with a deep indifference. If there was a positive point, it was that after what he had just undergone he had calmed down. Shaktler had now a conviction. The thing he had met and this human were not alike. The original was much worse. Welcome to the Murtharian Nerds. Chapter 586. You must feel so bad. Opening his eyes, Shaktler almost hoped it was another nightmare, but his new oracle status confirmed that this was indeed his new reality. He, a Shiral nobleman, was now the slave of another subrace. Indifferent to his new servant's breakdown stemming from the questioning of his entire existence after having flouted all his ideals, Jake was swimming through his oracle device's interface looking for the tab pertaining to his new slave. Having only one, it goes without saying that he found it rather quickly. Shaktler Zakal, Master, Jake Wilderth. Oracle rank 12, Second Lieutenant. Species, Blue Shiral. Bloodline, none. Ether stats, F, 1000, A, 1000, C, 1000, V, 1000, I, 1000, P, 1000, ESP, 1000, Cha, 100, CH, 100. Body stats, F, 56, A, 32, C, 68, V, 55, I, 99, P, 18. Spirit body LVL 29, Soul class, Ice Wizard. Ice Mana Core LVL 6. Ether Soul Core LVL 7. Ether Core, 112. Slave Contracts, 27. That was a lot of information to digest. Each piece of information gave access to a long slide with a lot of additional data, and Jake had a hard time finding his way through it. First, Shackler had no bloodline, not even a low-grade one, which was absurd for an evolver of his level. Secondly, and even more disturbingly, he had 3 different cores in his system, one of which he had never heard of. The third peculiarity that Jake had not seen anywhere else was the term soul class. Grash had vaguely made it clear to him that it was a characteristic of evolvers with 4 or more ordeals, but the Oracle system's censorship prevented him from telling him more. This was his chance to find out what it was all about. Clicking on the tab, the scroll revealed everything he wanted to know. He feared another censure, but this time his bracelet let him off the hook. Soul class, a soul specialization that can be attained based on an individual's personality, glyphs, actions, feats, and personal choices. A certain level of soul power is required to unlock a soul class. It can be awakened on its own or obtained through other means. Intermediate Ice Wizard. Intermediate affinity for ice magic and mana. Ice spell unlocked. Ice control LVL1. New ice spells will be unlocked when ice control is upgraded. For each spirit body level, intelligence plus 10%, extrasensory perception plus 10%. Jake understood better where this ice mana core came from. It must have been something he developed after acquiring his soul class. If it was from his 4th ordeal, it must have been very recent, but his ice mana core was already LVL 6. He had no idea what that meant in terms of power, but Shackler's pitiful resistance earlier hadn't impressed him at all. From what he understood, a soul class was like a bloodline, but inscribed directly on the soul itself. Their emergence seemed bound to happen with the right level of soul power, but its choice seemed to matter. One could change one's bloodline with great difficulty, but changing one's soul class meant altering one's soul. The latter had a more indelible quality to it, but he didn't know to what extent yet. He made a mental note to remember to ask Sect Mogasar when he paid him a visit. After all, this Munchkin Etherist was supposed to be his teacher, but hadn't taught him anything yet. The most shocking part, however, was that the percentage stats bonus provided by each spirit body level finally gave the spirit body a tangible role. This percentage was applied after the individual's real stats had been calculated, which meant that at LVL 29, Shackler's real intelligence was almost 3 times what his ether and body stats suggested. Is Intermediate Ice Wizard a good bloodline or a bad one? Jake mused inwardly with a thoughtful expression. It should be okay, she replied hesitantly before elaborating. But if it depends on the soul glyphs you already have, you should be able to get a much better one. Glancing quickly at his own soul glyphs, his gaze lingered on Harbinger of Chaos for a short while. Is it soul class material too? Jake shook his head with an embarrassed smile before diving back into his reading of Shackler's profile. Me too, I want to watch. Pretty please. An insistent meow in his ear disrupted his tranquility. Both Crunch and the orange turkey had their heads resting on his shoulders, giving him a beaten puppy look in an attempt to arouse his pity. Jake had no sympathy for the 2 pests, but he wanted to be left alone. Fine, look all you want. Jake conceded as he sent them Shackler's oracle status. Far from having the same centers of attention as their leader, Crunch and the turkey went straight to the logbook tab summarizing Shackler's entire history, including all the details about his personality, aspirations, and beliefs. Becoming a slave meant having no secrets from his new master. A few seconds later, giggles and uncontrolled laughter broke out on the side of the 2 fiendish animals, and Shackler could feel their gaze, mixed with pity and condescension, on him from time to time. At first, his headache prevented him from paying attention, but after a while their endless, discordant giggling came to haunt him even more than his own sense of humiliation. It was one thing to be a slave to an alien stronger than he was, but he wasn't going to be stepped on by 2 stupid beasts. What? He barked hatefully at the 2 troublemakers, which startled Jake and Melcree. Jake didn't know what else the 2 troublemakers had done, but he decided not to take sides. Melcree wore her trademark poker face, preferring the invigorating warmth of the campfire to their childish bickering. Instead of answering or stopping their guffaws, Crunch and the orange turkey burst out laughing even harder. They were currently reading Shackler's psychological profile and all the ridiculous feats he had performed to accomplish his dark designs, and when they saw his current plight, their mirth was overwhelming. After a while, Crunch, who was the only one of the two animals who could speak, said tauntingly, "Right now, you must feel so bad." Crack. The stalactite in Shackler's hand had just exploded in anger. Huge veins as large as earthworms had swollen on his forehead, irrefutable proof of his utter fury. I'm going to kill you." Alas for him, before he could even generate any killing ice spell, his wrenching headache exploded again in his skull, pushing his consciousness to the brink. This was the result of his fragmented soul. Right now, his soul was so damaged that he couldn't even mobilize 20% of his power. Otherwise, his performance against Jake would not have been so pathetic. Of course, Jake knew very well what was amusing his cat. How could a speciesist, racist, and extremist like Shackler tolerate becoming the absolute and eternal slave of what he abhorred above all else? It was as if a fanatic of one religion was forced to convert to another, or perhaps even worse. Still, the fact that he eventually complied proved that his convictions were not as unyielding as the alien initially believed. Shackler was clearly favoring his survival over his ideals. At least, that's what he thought. Jake had a more flexible outlook on the world. Whatever his beliefs, alignment, or aspirations, he knew that nothing was untouchable, let alone eternal. The mirror universe was so vast that there were bound to be brainwashing methods advanced enough to completely rewrite an individual's personality, as Jake had just done. True will, mind training, etc. only increased his resistance to this kind of influence, but it was impossible to guarantee the sanctity of his soul. The corruption in his last ordeal had proven to him that one's ethics and principles were no match for an all-powerful compulsion. Shackler thought he had unwavering resolve, but that was an illusion. Jake himself only acted the way he did because of a fortunate combination of circumstances. If he had been born and raised in a different environment, met different people, his character and values would naturally have been different. In this respect, even abject criminals like Buzzcock, Yarrowed, and Lamine were pardonable. But he had neither the time nor the heart to forgive or rehabilitate them. Jake therefore had a much more simplistic way of thinking. If they were his enemies, he would kill them without hesitation. Simple as that. Now that Shackler was his servant, he couldn't leave him in this agonizing state. Jake had no tangible solution to heal his soul, but he could already help him recover from his physical wounds. First, he ordered him to join the Murtharian Nerds. His Blue Blood faction immediately became a sub-faction of his. Its first faction skill was a passive skill also named Blue Blood. Its workings were somewhat special. All faction members would have their ether stats lowered by 1% per level of the skill. The noble-blooded Shirals designated by Shackler would then be permanently buffed by sharing this pool of ether stat points. This was objectively a very powerful faction skill, albeit biased towards a small group of individuals. It fit perfectly with Shackler's elitist and racist vision and could indeed give him an incredible boost under normal circumstances. Bad luck for him. Most of his subordinates had died in the last few days. After he entered the dungeon, this buff had already been halved, and now it was practically zero after the massacre perpetrated by Ural. Chapter 587, The Fourth Floor. Jake wondered if this first faction skill would be carried over now that Blue Blood was only a sub-faction of the Murtharian Nerds, and the answer was no. The previous faction skills had been reset, with those of the Murtharian Nerds taking precedence. The good news was that Shackler could now choose new ones. These faction skills were substantially weaker than the previous ones in terms of prowess, but they were in addition to the main ones. Each member could only join one sub-faction on top of the main faction, so this choice was not to be taken lightly. The good thing was that it was very easy to defect from one faction to another. As Jake had once verified, becoming a sub-faction made it impossible for it to become independent again. If by some miracle Shackler managed to free himself from his slave contract and left the Murtharian Nerds, his original faction would be left behind. He did not even have the authority to dissolve it. That privilege was reserved for the main faction's leader. This was a necessary precaution, since otherwise any new member would have been able to create their own sub-faction within the main faction. Besides the obvious logistical issues this could entail, most faction skills only reach their full potential with a sufficient number of members, not to mention the fact that sub-factions could also be leveled up. The problem was that the number of members in these sub-factions also counted towards the total amount of members in the main faction. Rationally speaking, it made more sense to focus on as few sub-factions as possible. For the moment, Jake would keep Blue Blood off the hook. The Murtharian nerds had just over 100 members out of the 800 available spots, and he didn't have to worry about those pesky details yet. Still, if there were too many of them, it would be Blue Blood who would be unquestioningly discarded. To convince him otherwise, Shackler would have to put that work in. Jake hadn't joined or created any sub-factions yet, but he already had an idea of the one he wanted to create. Nevertheless, that would have to wait until the end of this expedition. Contrary to what one might have thought, Shackler did not feel so bad about his situation. Only a racist and narcissistic nobleman would believe that the rest of the universe thought like him. When he joined the Murtharian nerds, he had mentally prepared himself for tyrannical faction skills favoring the leader and his trusted officers, but he was pleasantly surprised when he discovered the new perks. This Murtharian body, it was unexpectedly good. He understood better why the mortality rate was so low among this faction's refugees. They were not playing fair in the first place. Too bad this Murtharian body was not very compatible with his blue chiral physique and soul class. The cold was his friend, but this passive faction skill was biased towards the opposite. In any case, it was not a handicap either. It simply meant that he was now both cold and heat resilient. In addition, his body stats had more than doubled, and that also included his intelligence, constitution, and vitality, so valuable to a spellcaster. Now, do you intend to tell us why you were so terrified when you saw me? Jake broke the ice first when he saw that Shackler had regained his sanity. He already had an idea of the answer, but he wanted to hear it from Chiral. By remembering these bad memories, the alien started to tremble again, and a painful grimace resulting from the rebound of his migraine distorted his face. Thankfully, the crisis ended quickly enough this time. Gasping for breath and his clothes drenched in sweat, Shackler closed his eyes for a moment to properly choose his words, then stated gingerly, "Because if my faction and I ended up in this state, it was because of you." "Me?" Jake stroked his chin thoughtfully, his assumption confirmed. "Jake?" Melcree muttered in disbelief. "Him. Crunch me out comically with a delay. Gobble." Realizing the nonsense of his statement, Shackler immediately corrected himself. "Not the real you, but a carbon copy, or if I may say even better. It was a digester version of you. On the next floor, you'll have to fight yourself if you want to survive." "Please elaborate." Jake invited him to continue his tale with a solemn frown. "Sure." Shackler bowed respectfully. No matter how he felt, he could not disobey an order from his master. Gathering his thoughts, he recounted thoughtfully, "The next floor is the opposite of this one, but takes the inhospitality a notch higher. The air is hot and dry. There is no water, no atmosphere, and a blinding artificial sun shines down over us, following us wherever we go. The ground is nothing but rock, metal, and lava as far as the eye can see, but paradoxically, there is vegetation flourishing down there. In addition to the digesters that look like you, there are also many creatures and human digesters of various shapes and forms swarming in this hostile environment. Before, I couldn't say for sure, but now I can tell they all have your Murtharian bloodline. Your bloodline seems to have an auxiliary role, giving them benefits without taking away their abolites or changing their morphology extensively. Jake digesters, I'll call them like that for now, are like the orcs on the second floor. Rarer than the goblins, but numerous enough to come across one from time to time. The closer you get to the entrance to the lower floor, the more likely you are to run into a squad of them. Now, Jake wasn't just frowning. He was now pulling an ugly face, and his heart sank in his chest. Getting past the fourth floor was certainly impossible. The others may not have had a clear and complete understanding of his abilities, but he did. At rank 7 or 8, his digester clones would have between 2 and 5 times his ether stats. If they fought half as well as he did, there was already reason to panic. Should I stop here? It's up to you. She didn't give her opinion this time. It was his decision to make, but it was her job not to hide anything from him. The danger will be great, but the environment will also be favorable to you. Fighting against yourself will undoubtedly be an invaluable experience, and the loot dropped by these digester clones is likely to be tailored to you. You may die, it's true, but Shackler survived. If I were an optimist, I'd say that if he can do it, you should too. As long as you just take a look, you should be fine. Jake understood his Oracle AI's points, but they both knew for a fact that he wasn't exactly the cautious type. Once there, the urge to beat the crap out of his clone to prove he was the man would undoubtedly overshadow his common sense. It was the Myrmidian part of his bloodline that he couldn't disavow. Shackler, how do my clones fight? Do they fight like primitive beasts, or do they have a keen sense of combat? Jake asked out of the blue after considering several options. Shackler may have said that these digesters were his clones, but not all the goblins and orcs on the second floor looked 100% alike either. If he wasn't mistaken, the equivalent of goblins would be human digesters with his Myrtharian bloodline, but his flawless clones would be far less common. The ambush on the second floor had already proven to them that these orcs and goblin digesters could evolve by killing their own kind as well, and there was a serious possibility that some of these Jakes were even more talented than he was. Heck, they might even have skills that he, the original, didn't even have. Shirl's response confirmed his fears. I'm not sure, but the one who slaughtered my faction was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. Half as tall as you and with an incomprehensible fighting instinct. He could use any weapon with incredible expertise, and his control of matter has reached a level of finesse and precision I can only dream of. Jake couldn't believe it, but instead of losing his courage, his curiosity found itself magnified. Even if I die, I absolutely must check this out in person. Seeing the swirl of galaxy like lights shining in his master's pupils, Shackler's shoulders sagged, and his face turned pale with despair. He could see it. Jake's fighting intent rising to the sky. We're dead. It seems your decision is made. Don't regret it. She sighed without showing any surprise. She had foreseen his choice from the beginning. She lived in his head and knew his reckless and adventurous nature better than anyone else. By the way, Jake suddenly thought of something. You said it was my clone that routed you. So why did we come across the corpses of your subordinates lying in the snow a few meters from here? All signs point to their death at the hands of Ural. That is indeed the case. Shackler explained with a dejected look. Your clone killed everyone who accompanied me to the fourth floor, but not everyone had followed us down there. The third floor was already the limit for most of my subordinates, and they chose to wait here for rescue. By the time I returned alone alive from the fourth floor, Ural had already passed by. Chapter 588 Mysterious Woman. I'm sorry about your subordinates, but this gives me renewed optimism for the rest of my companions. Jake blurted out tactlessly. Inwardly, however, his thoughts were quite different. I hope none of them are stupid enough to explore that fourth floor. Even if they do, help should be on the way. We've been in this dungeon for almost a day now. Maybe they're even here already. Alas, Jake wasn't the only one whose curiosity and the promise of power and juicy rewards could drive to do foolish things against all common sense. Elsewhere in the snowy dunes, where an endless blizzard was raging, another group was also about to cross the point of no return. Across a snow-covered hillside similar to the one where Jake and his group were standing, 3 humans and a huge lion stared at the dark entrance to a cavern leading into the dungeon's depths. Because this grotto had been buried by an avalanche, they could only detect it with their other senses, but an unexpected clue tipped them off. These blood trails, are you sure they belong to Buzzcock? Kyle inquired suspiciously. Indeed, the snow in front of them was strewn with purple bloodstains, and that was their only tangible proof that they were not on the wrong track. The problem was that it was neither Kyle nor Mufasa and his keen sense of smell that had picked up this trail, but the veiled woman traveling along with them. Furthermore, these bloodstains did not belong to just one person. There were many stains, and they had found several frozen corpses along the way. After the scuffle where she had temporarily snatched the spherical crystal containing the ether skill devour, the tension and distrust in the group towards her had reached its peak. This was in addition to the caution Kyle already had to exercise toward his own sister who kept trying to murder him. For a while, they had continued to hunt quietly on the second floor, hunting elite goblins, orcs and other tautais, until they finally realized that the drop rate was just awful. But more importantly, these elite digesters were hard to come by, and unlike the other monsters, their ranks were not replenished as easily. Wanting to find out where these digesters came from, Kyle and his group had gone so far as to spy on a group of goblins without killing them, and when they were about to give up the tailing, they had finally witnessed a spawn. The goblin had simply popped out of nowhere, totally naked. They then had followed him and watched his behavior covertly to see how they evolved. At first, the goblin seemed lost and haggard as a newborn, but make no mistake, it was no baby. After only a few minutes, the digester's movements had become seamless, and he could already generate a certain amount of silver chitin. Emulating his comrades, he soon started wearing a loincloth and carrying a short sword. A few newly spawned goblins swelled their ranks until they came upon another squad of slightly different-looking goblins. A skirmish ensued where the goblin they were watching made his first kill. His size had grown slightly, and his strength, agility, and intelligence had increased markedly. The following battles became easier, and Kyle saw him quickly rise through the ranks. Their group gave him a few helping hands by secretly eliminating dangerous enemies. Soon, there was no need for that anymore. In less than an hour, this newborn goblin evolved into an elite hobgoblin. It was an incredibly fast evolutionary cycle, but this power gain came at the cost of many lives of his brethren. Even after his power-up, this hobgoblin was not invincible, and they watched him get chomped to death when their small army ran into a Tautai digester. Ironically, Kyle and Mufasa felt almost sad to see their protege get eaten so miserably, but it also brought their little Darwinian experiment to an abrupt end. The group went back to hunting, deciding to head for the lower level, until a deforested area covered in digesters' guts and blood told them that a terrible fight had just taken place. Slightly fluorescent purple blood mixed with the silver liquid, and the scan revealed the following information. Nawai Vurag, ogre blood, belongs to Buzzcock. Because Kyle had openly scanned Buzzcock in his mansion, his bracelet could easily compare the report on this sample to his previous data to authenticate the person. Even though the Oracle system was malfunctioning, the scans and their Oracle devices were still functional. For the young man, this revelation had been like a shot of adrenaline, and it had immediately stirred up the rage that he was barely able to keep under control. His plans had immediately changed, and his goal of wiping out the digesters on the third floor had turned into a personal vendetta. Fortunately, Mufasa and the veiled woman did not object. Against all odds, the mysterious female evolver had even supported him in his endeavor, suddenly becoming more outgoing and talkative. You should go for it. It's not healthy to bottle up your hate. My name is Hecate. I won't help you kill him, but I can guide you to him. And why should I trust you? You're not helping us. You're acting suspicious. You're trying to steal our rewards, and all of a sudden, with no warning, you act generous? If you had acted like this from the beginning, it would be different, but we know how strong you are. You don't belong with us. For all I know, you could be another Ural. At least if you want us to trust you, show us your face. Kyle had become justifiably peeved. Fine, as you wish. She complied, stumping him. Then, she slowly lowered her hood with her long, gloved fingers, revealing a cascade of jet black hair swaying in the non-existent wind. She then removed her mask, and a blemish-free, but extremely pale, baby face was revealed to them. She had delicate features, a graceful jaw, and radiant green eyes filled with an inexplicable melancholy. Her eyelids were half closed, giving the impression that she was either jaded or sleep-deprived. Her dark circles accentuated this impression, but it could just as well have been makeup because she had no wrinkles. Her lips were a sickly purplish color, as if they were poorly oxygenated, but the most discouraging thing was their natural angle, giving the illusion of a perpetual sneer. An unpatterned gold tiara hugged her forehead, bringing some flavor to this graveyard beauty, but the ornament wasn't flashy enough to distract from her short, pointed ears protruding from her hair. Upon seeing her face, Kyle and Maeve were transfixed on the spot, but for different reasons. The former playboy was suffering from a crush the likes of which he hadn't experienced since his college days, while his sister couldn't believe that a woman could be both beautiful and sickening at the same time. Seen enough? Hecate asked with a slight smirk that was at times teasing, at times dismissive. Her eyes, however, remained icy and dead. Kyle forced himself to stop gawking at her and cleared his throat to cover his embarrassment. Cough, it's enough. I accept your offer. And that was where they currently stood. As promised, Hecate had shown them the way by miraculously picking up the trail. Buzzcock wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but he wasn't senile either. Although Kyle didn't know that he had been spiritually injured by Svara, it wouldn't be enough to make him forget basic survival precautions. His fight with a Tautai elite digester while his soul was still wounded was an accident, but he had been careful after his victory not to leave any clues behind that could lead to him. Neither Kyle nor Mufasa had spotted any trace of dried blood or footprints, and they had followed Hecate blindly, without any guarantee that the trail existed. They had gone through the entire 3rd floor and fought against those calamitous snowworms with only a verbal promise from a shady outsider as a guarantee, and this new blood evidence was a huge relief. He went down to the 4th floor. Mufasa growled as he shook himself to get rid of the snow embedded in his fur. That's dangerous. Are you sure you want to pursue your revenge? Given his condition, there's a good chance he'll die without your help. The lion had a point, but Kyle shook his head reluctantly after giving a tender look in his sister's direction. The hateful glare he got in return had broken his heart. I have to kill him with my own hands. If he is killed by a digester, Maeve will be free, but she will keep trying to kill me because of the indoctrination she has undergone. The only way to correct this is to get her slave contract back. If he is really hurt, it is also likely that another evolver will take the opportunity to finish him off, and if that happens it will become a never-ending nightmare. I absolutely must go down to prevent this scenario. Then, let's go down together. Mufasa decided matter-of-factly. I hope we have better luck than those corpses around us down there. Even though the lion hadn't said anything, they could see that some of them hadn't died of frostbite. If it wasn't the work of another evolver, it promised to be a piping hot place downstairs. Chapter 589, They're Already Here. Fumdaff, I don't have a good feeling about this floor. Will paused as he donned his spacesuit helmet for the first time. As soon as they emerged from the tunnel, the freezing wind had disappeared, replaced by a scorching temperature and zero atmosphere. At this point, they couldn't even breathe. As soon as they stepped into the cave, their lungs were emptied of air, and the 2 Nawai warriors' skin began to blister from the heat and radiation. The creatures Will had tamed were only slightly better off thanks to accepting his invitation to the Murtharian nerds. Fumdaff and Iskar immediately backtracked into the tunnel to escape the inferno, but not before suffering a few more burns. Their normally muddy skin had turned a disturbing shade of pink, obviously suffering its first sunburn since they became evolvers. The veteran warrior Iskar's turquoise braids were scorching, and the surprise burst of heat had made him drop his mace, which was now glowing a little further on the ground. The hand holding the weapon was charred, the smell of cooked meat wafting through their nostrils. Flaming hell! What the bloody fuck is this shithole? The warrior cursed, gritting his teeth until the pain passed. Fortunately for them, as 4th ordeal evolvers, their constitution and vitality were decent, or they wouldn't have fared so well. After a few minutes, their skin regained its usual dull color, and their blisters were starting to heal. Noticing that neither Will nor his creatures had been hurt, Fumdaff, who was more composed than his counterpart, asked inquisitively, "Hey, why are you all okay? We didn't last 5 seconds in that blazing sun, but you almost seemed to enjoy it. I would get the dragon, but I didn't see any of you cultivating any fire or light magic." "Because we don't," Will retorted laconically. "It's simply the benefit of our leader's Murtharian body, which is also our primary faction skill. If you are still interested, my offer to join the Murtharian nerds still stands." Fumdaff and Iskar flinched as the merchant extended his invitation again. They were still part of the Shurbai tribe for 2 reasons. One was out of loyalty, as their minds were not yet fully made up, and the second was because it allowed them to monitor the actions of Buzzcock and their other comrades. Alas, because of the dungeon walls, the faction chat was not working properly most of the time, and the number of remaining members had not changed in several hours, which was highly unlikely given the dangers they had been facing. Now Will was presenting them with a clear statement that without him, they would not be able to go any further. Fumdaff and Iskar might have their trump cards, but it was clearly not worth sacrificing them to survive a few more instants in this furnace, which promised to be even more dangerous than the 3rd floor. Fumdaff and Will had tried to take control of these snowworms, but it hadn't worked the way they had hoped. The intelligence of these monsters was too limited to understand human language, So Charisma Ether's verbal commands were ineffective. Not that it would have made any difference. These digesters didn't have the same beauty standards, and these worms had no eyes or ears, not to mention spending most of their time under the snow. Fumdaf's spirit magic had worked a little better, but these spells were not as easy to use as the others. Whether attacking, manipulating, or defending, the caster's mental strength was the fundamental criterion for success, and unfortunately the soul and spirit body did not recover as easily as the rest of the body. Although they had managed to reach the 4th floor, it had been a real struggle, and they were all exhausted. If Fumdaf and Iskar had to use their remaining strength to resist the heat, they might as well stop here. The thing was that the two Naways did not want to leave it at that. These snowworms may have been a pain to fight, but the rewards were worth it. Their ether stats had all improved, and the multicolored snake had even earned an intermediate ether armor, perhaps because of their similar morphology. After a brief hesitation, Fumdaf and Iskar settled their dilemma. The steely resolve in the spirit mage's eyes told them that he had made his decision and would brook no regrets. My tribe, I'm sorry. I need to become stronger if I want to save you. You have received an invitation from Vice Leader Will Hopkins to join the Murtharian Nerds. Do you accept? Yes/no. Taking a deep breath, Fumdaf clicked on the notification and accepted the invitation. With a complicated expression, the old Nawai warrior did the same. Shortly thereafter, they felt an unfamiliar and radiant energy flow into their cells, promising a myriad of changes. Will had not explained anything to them, letting them be surprised, and the two Naways were unable to hide their amazement as they discovered their new body stats. The two evolvers already had beefy bodies, their height exceeding that of the tallest Earthmen by more than a head. With this Murtharian body passive, they felt like they were reborn. Prudently, Fumdaf walked under the sun of the 4th floor and tensed up waiting for a pain that never came. The heat was still blistering, but no worse than a forced walk in the desert. But most interestingly, he could feel how his cells were absorbing a portion of that heat and radiation to produce more energy and oxygen. With his current constitution, he felt no sensation of suffocation. As long as they kept their stamina up, they could survive here for a while. Now, we might have a chance. Fumdaf clenched his fists tightly in excitement as he stared at the fake sun above him. Yeah, but you better get into that suit. Will broke his joy by throwing him a spacesuit and an oxygen tank. Walking alone towards the unknown, shaking his head, the two Naways heard him click his tongue. Tisk, TSK, I can't take these overconfident boars anymore. They don't burn in the sun anymore, and that's it. They think they are invincible. While Jake, Kyle, Will, and many other survivors struggled to explore the inhospitable 4th floor, elsewhere, other evolvers of a different breed had other considerations. In an ocean as black as oil and from which escaped a smell of licorice and hydrocarbon, an old emaciated man wearing a long and plain black robe was moving as best he could in this water reaching his knees. It was pitch black in this abyss, but the old man seemed to know exactly where he was going. His robe was torn in several places, and because of its dark hue, the dried black blood belonging to its owner was indiscernible. Wading through this black water, whose viscosity approached that of jam, the old man suddenly straightened his head up when many hooded figures emerged around him. All of them seemed to have braved hell to get here, and most had not escaped unscathed. Not alarmed at all, Nelakai stopped hiking and sneered when he saw that some familiar faces were missing. Don't tell me Garo escaped, the necromancer said as he saw them shamefully bow their heads. Lost Divinities does not live up to its reputation. One of the hooded figures, perhaps one of the few whose cloak was intact, took 2 steps forward and warned him icily. Don't criticize what you can't fathom. Lost Divinities is not something a mere undead like you can join. If we didn't have orders, we'd kill you outright. But you need me alive to fight the Dungeon Digester's persona. At the very least, you need my Secret of the Damned. My Death March recruited quite a few recruits today. If some stupid orc hadn't messed up, I might have more. We're not here to hear your whining. We're only here to inform you of some changes. I'm listening. Feeling the atmosphere grow heavy, Nelakai abandoned his haughty air and began to listen seriously to the report. As you guessed, we lost track of Garo Knight on the 4th floor. We were well on our way to cornering him, but the floor boss intervened. Most of our injuries came from there. You're telling me that a digester on the 4th floor managed to get your renegade group in this state? How is that possible? The old man made no secret of his deep contempt for their poor performance. If a simple digester boss is causing you so much trouble, I doubt you'll be of any use in the fight for the Nexus. Don't be arrogant, the hooded individual scolded. Most newborn dungeon digesters lack samples and practice, but once in a while they manage to create something unexpected. This floor boss and all its derivatives are a success. The environment they live in multiplies their strength and makes them almost unkillable. If you haven't met this digester, count yourself lucky. Exceptional men choose their battles. Only a fool would go up against these monsters. I already have my cuties for that. Nelakai chuckled as he suddenly tapped the ground with his black staff. The slimy water around him began to swirl, forming an obscure siphon leading to an unknown destination. Found it, the old man croaked grimly. Not taking offense at the necromancer's defiant arrogance, the hooded leader calmly finished his report, this time with a hint of sarcasm, mingled with a pinch of pity. I forgot to say it, but Garos failed. The Oracle Overseer realized the deception and ordered a purge. The Oracle Guardians dispatched to save us are already here. I guess I don't have to tell you. What fate awaits you if they get the Nexus before you? Lost Divinities is not a name just for show. Believe me, you don't want to meet them as a loser. Hearing this, Nelakai shivered, but he refrained from answering. Then, he jumped into the hole, coolly letting himself be carried away by the siphon. Chapter 590. The Oracle Guardians are here. Tens of thousands of kilometers off, a huge black cube supposedly invisible was orbiting right above a gigantic spiral rocky peak, whose top was buried in this thick layer of stormy clouds. The colossal technological jewel was not exactly stationary, but it kept coming back to the same point, as if the flying object was patrolling in a well-defined circular trajectory. Inside, a glorious Oracle city, flagship and embodiment of the Oracle's supremacy, had lost all its former grandeur and majesty. Once a place of pleasure and speculation for evolvers lucky enough to access the Oracle playground, this expensive sanctuary was now a mess. All the mansions, hotels, stores, and other essential buildings had been wiped out. The only exception was the transportation tower in the center and the huge colored cubes positioned equidistantly around it. Amidst the ruins, these cubes glowed faintly with a faint ruby, sapphire, emerald, or amber radiance, reminding any remaining survivors that this was once a prosperous city. The most confusing part was that there was not just one ruined city inside this cube. In fact, like a certain dungeon, there were many floors. Instead of the fake sunny sky once visible in the Oracle City, a flat, smooth ceiling forged from uranium served as the base for another similar city. In total, the immense black cube had several dozen Oracle cities that were intrinsically similar, but also fundamentally different. At this moment, these differences could not be seen since everything had been destroyed, but by excavating the rubble it was still possible to detect some clues. These different crumbling Oracle cities served the same purpose: to welcome evolvers to feast, rest, invest, but most of all to spend their freshly earned ether. Few evolvers were lucid enough to invest in these places, but those who did were given a springboard for expansion on B842 and a steady source of income. The biggest distinction between these Oracle cities lay in one thing: they were not intended for the same clientele. All of them were accessible from the Oracle playground, but not all aliens had the same habits and customs, and their morphologies and sizes varied greatly from one species to another. The smallest of these Oracle cities seemed to have been built for Lilliputians, or at least species of comparable size, while the highest layer had an excessively high ceiling, very clearly dedicated to a population that wouldn't pass through conventional doors. However, these ruined cities, vestige of the Oracle's supreme authority, were not devoid of life. If one listened carefully, it was possible to hear a teeth-chattering hubbub, a dissonant mixture of shrill cackling and blood-curdling squealing. If you opened your eyes, though, you could see hell. Gray batrachian skin monsters as far as the eye could see. Some of them were covered with a silver chitin exoskeleton harder than steel, while others had more conventional appearances, but had their place in the most creative nightmares. The reason why the light given off by the intact cubes was so weak was because tens of thousands of these monsters were currently swarming on the surface of these, greedily absorbing the minute traces of ether that leaked off them. While this black cube and its oracle city seemed destined to wither away until the last cube in these ruins was completely extinguished, their ether core vampirized from their last ounce of ether, something happened. The yellow cube atop one of the transportation towers emitted a blinding flash of light comparable to a supernova. The thousands of digesters crawling on top of it shook nervously, their shrill cackling resuming in earnest. The attention of the sluggish monsters nearby was also drawn, and they all began to flock to the light simultaneously, with an insatiable fire in their silver eyes, like suicidal moths flying towards a flame. The brightness intensified again, and a huge blast of energy blew away all the digesters and rubble in a 500-meter radius. Oddly, the transportation tower remained intact, but one more person stood on the platform atop it. Nearly 5 meters high, its torso had 6 arms, one of them holding an energy shield covering 2/3 of its body, while another arm carefully held the pommel of a blade still in its sheath. The other 4 arms were crossed, displaying his profound disinterest in this mission. The silvery metallic suit of unknown material was as usual, with bluish lines of light drawing together thousands of incomprehensible runes. The helmet vaguely resembled those of the ancient Greek phalanxes, but the space leaving the face visible had been replaced by a kind of opaque black liquid. No doubt, it was an Oracle Guardian, and a rather strong one at that. The weakest in their hierarchy had only 4. Even Garos, the Oracle Guardian captain serving the Overseer Oris, was no exception. The Oracle Guardian looked around the devastated Oracle City and growled loudly. His snort alone shook the tower, and the sound wave spread to the other side of the city until it hit the black cube's walls, forming ripples on its surface. All digesters on the scene, regardless of rank, promptly imploded after being hit by the sound blast. Those who were a little more reactive or able to fly tried to escape, but only those on the edge of the black cube or near an orange cube managed to escape in time. After purging the black cube of its unwanted squatters, the Oracle Guardian scanned the black cube for survivors before remembering that he had just eliminated any chance of there being any after his dispassionate snort. "Oh, I overdid it. My bad. I hope Oris won't see this, or I'll be demoted again." The alien frowned guiltily, but this was clearly not the first time this kind of mistake had happened. "Still, I need to do the job I'm paid for." The Oracle Guardian took a step forward, and the next moment the ruined city beneath his feet had disappeared, replaced by the sidereal void and the distant landscape of a huge planet. Even from here, he could see the hundreds of thousands of flying or free-falling digesters that were trying to leave the ship, the black cube, after his arrival. Uncrossing his 2 lower pairs of arms, the alien clasped his hands behind his back in apparent nonchalance and reversed the force field, allowing him to levitate. His body quickly began to plummet, and as soon as he entered the dense atmosphere of the mesosphere, his body was so fast that it ignited due to the friction with these molecules. The top of the spiral rocky promontory soon appeared in his line of sight, and it was obvious that the surviving digesters were fleeing in that direction. Despite the urgency of his mission, the Oracle Guardian was in no particular hurry and did not attempt to artificially accelerate his fall. He saw the experience as a simple ride, calmly enjoying the scenery around him. Nevertheless, even taking his time, he soon hit the ground. The deafening crash formed a monstrous shockwave around the epicenter, and a crater hundreds of meters wide and dozens of meters deep replaced the conical mountain standing as the entrance to the dungeon. Refugees, creatures, and other evolvers exploring the dungeon digester underneath were the direct victims, as a cataclysmic earthquake interrupted whatever they were doing at the time. Even the digesters were no exception. The closer a floor was to the surface, the worse it was. Obviously a newborn. The alien chuckled jadedly as he stomped on the floor. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so stupid as to erect such an unnatural mountain over its kingdom. As if it couldn't live without a hat. At least I guess my mission makes sense now. Destroying newborn dungeon digesters and snatching their nexuses has always been my guilty pleasure. As the lone Oracle Guardian was about to make his way into the dungeon digester, several huge digesters got in the way. Glancing at them expertly, he remained unfazed until he caught sight of the creature at the very back. At that moment, he uncurled his fingers from behind his back and drew his long sword. His opposite arm raised its shield, while the remaining 4 hands assumed different postures, each holding a different ether artifact. 7 rank 11s and 1 rank 12 digester. The alien listed solemnly. Well, I underestimated your evolving speed, but that doesn't change my mission. On the contrary, it makes my presence even more indispensable. Well, I suppose you'll make a good warm-up. As he prepared to engage in a fight of epic proportions, the Oracle Guardian looked up as he heard a whistling noise and smiled. I guess I won't be fighting alone this time. The warrior joked as he saw a shooting star crash a few feet away from him. Next to its crater, this one wasn't worth mentioning. An arachnoid creature with 6 pairs of legs and a shiny black abdomen crawled out of its little hole and stood at attention. Oracle Guardian Cocoon at your service. The other Oracle Guardian could see that this was just a rookie from its deference, but even though his eyes smiled benevolently, his brain was cogitating at full speed. Why did Horus send another Oracle Guardian for a simple newborn dungeon? Does he really think that my presence alone is not enough? Or maybe this edition wasn't planned in the first place. Chapter 591 Lord Phoenix. Jake didn't waste a single second. Once he made up his mind, nothing could stop him. A moment later, he and his group stepped out of their dark tunnel, and an otherworldly sunshine poured its deadly rays upon their faces, which were still rosy from the icy wind on the floor above. Shactler was clearly dragging his feet behind them, but his foul mood could do nothing against the absolute orders of his new master. He, who much preferred the blizzard, braced himself for the fiery burns to come, but relaxed when he saw that the sun rays were quite bearable. Told you, you worry about nothing. Crunch me out as he trotted with his head held high in this barren, volcanic world. The orange turkey on his back, however, wasn't faring all that well. His stats were the lowest of the group, and even with the Murtharian body, that radiation was slowly but surely frying him. The consolation was that it was stimulating his cells. If he persevered and survived until then, his body stats would be greatly enhanced. So much for naming yourself Lord Phoenix. Jake twisted the knife in the wound of the poor turkey, his nostrils flaring as he smelled roast chicken in the air. More like Lord Fry Chicken. Crunch snickered, though using his fur as a screen to protect the wretched bird. Gobble. Lord Phoenix gobbled indignantly as he received these successive taunts, but there was little he could do given the circumstances other than patiently endure while dreaming of his future revenge. The turkey had chosen his name a few minutes earlier while listening to Crunch tell him an anecdote. Apparently, the black cat had encountered such a mythical bird in his second ordeal and had almost died. The turkey had been deeply moved and had immediately renamed himself Lord Phoenix. What Crunch didn't tell him was that this famous phoenix had ultimately been hunted thanks to the seamless cooperation between Mufasa and Shere Khan. The poor mythical bird had ended up as a late afternoon snack for the feline pride. Taking advantage of the fact that a phoenix could rise from its ashes, the felines had thrown the bones into the fire as many times as necessary until they were fully satiated. So much so that when they had eventually left this legendary phoenix in peace, it had cursed them for 13 generations, and the rest of their ordeal had been a living hell. It turned out that this phoenix was a toddler and had a very possessive mother and father. But that story was for another time for obvious reasons. The one who wasn't talking at all right now, however, was Melkri. She was the only one in the group who was not a member of the Murtharian nerds. She may have been the only supposed survivor of her faction, but she hadn't disbanded it yet. Strangely enough, although she felt little emotion, she sometimes behaved in a very human way. The problem was that Melkri was basically a plant. As much as she needed sunlight to grow, this kind of sunlight was way beyond the threshold of radiation and heat that a tree could endure. Without her high ether stats, she might have looked worse than the turkey. "Are you sure you don't want to join my faction?" Jake asked in a concerned tone. If she agreed, she could have healed much faster and even progressed beyond her former limitations. "It's not needed for now," she answered flatly, though her shifting eyes betrayed her hesitation. The truth was, she didn't trust him yet. His performance had been excellent so far, and he had even saved her life, but her only points of comparison were with Buzzcock and Shactler, two tyrants devoid of morals and capable of the most heinous crimes. But above all, the cruel and decisive mercilessness that Jake could show as he had earlier with Shactler had also shown her that this human was not an innocent soul. Until she was clear on whether it was instability or fortitude, she would continue to feel like she was walking on eggshells. Like Will earlier, Jake had not been cocky in discovering this new environment devoid of atmosphere, but he had not equipped his spacesuit either. Since his bloodline and body stats were far more advanced, he benefited much more from completely removing his armor. Where Will and Kyle still needed an external source of oxygen, with this heat, radiation, and telluric soil, Jake had everything he needed to sustain himself indefinitely. After all, the Cantharians came from a planet with an environment many times more inhospitable than this one. Right now, Jake wore only shorts and walked barefoot on the hot rock. The heat and radiation stimulated his Murtharian bloodline, making the network of lava veins running through his body apparent. His golden and silver mane shone, while the galactic glow of his pupils was visible from hundreds of meters away. He was in great shape. His cells had no trouble withstanding the stresses of this hostile environment and were converting all that energy into oxygen and other nutrients for his body with ease. His passive healing skill was also activated, allowing him to recover from any injury even without doing anything. Jake probably wouldn't have to pay anything to activate bloodline ignition this time. Usually he had to mobilize his ether core and sacrifice stamina for it, but this environment provided enough energy to make up for the losses. Here, Jake was at least twice as powerful as anywhere else, and that was even more glaring compared to the frigid territory of the third floor. Needless to say, Shackler and Melcree could definitively feel it. The lack of atmosphere had one major drawback, though. There was no sound. To communicate, they had to use telepathy, but not everyone was capable of that. "I guess you'll have to shut up this time, Crunch," Jake joked, his face beaming with happiness. As long as he didn't take the initiative to connect his mind to his cat's, the cat couldn't tell him anything. Will had foresight, but not to the point of planning spacesuits for huge felines. As a result, Crunch couldn't even speak into a microphone. Lord Phoenix should have been treated the same way, but he was small enough to fit into a suit. Jake didn't need his, so he lent it to him, and by squeezing himself in, the turkey managed to fit perfectly into the helmet. Fortunately for them, he spared them his sulky gobbles. Shackler had arranged for his own suit, and Jake didn't have to worry about him. As for Melcree, she seemed able to breathe normally with the help of her photosynthesis. The group progressed for several kilometers without encountering anyone or anything, and Jake began to wonder if Shackler had been telling them anything at all. This floor was just a flat, hot rock, except for a few volcanoes, one of which was particularly majestic in the distance. The ground was completely flat, although riddled with craters of varying widths. There was vegetation and even tall trees with a network of sap emitting a soft orange light as fiery as its own veins, but nowhere near as dense as the forest on the second floor. With so few obstructions hindering their vision, Jake should have been able to spot potential enemies easily, but they hadn't run into anyone so far. "Are you sure this floor was crawling with digesters? So far it really looks like a dead asteroid," Jake questioned Shackler, raising a wary eyebrow. The Shiro looked as confused as he was. He hadn't made up the enemies that had slaughtered his faction. "I swear they were everywhere when I came here with my comrades. I have no idea where they all went. There are no dead bodies, no signs of fighting either," Melcree remarked as she examined the handful of dust flowing through her fingers. Jake activated his Murtharian sight and spotted numerous ether dots in the distance towards the main volcano. "Looks like the digesters have regrouped," he concluded with a somber look on his face. "I don't know if they've been lured by something or if they're following the dungeon's orders, but it doesn't look good to me." "We can still turn around," Shackler suggested graciously. "We can, but we won't." Jake cut the debate short, immediately ruining his renewed hope. He then offered for the others. "If you don't want to come, I won't force anyone." Shackler's face lit up, about to back out when Jake clarified. "Except you, Shackler. I need a meat shield in case something happens." As if Jake was the kind of guy to let such a bully off the hook so easily. He had a better chance of getting his redemption by going straight to hell. Now that Jake had located the enemies, he had no reason to cautiously explore the area. He immediately used his earth gliding skill, taking the rest of his companions with him. The group began to cut through the rock as if the ground were a silent sea, swallowing up the miles at breakneck speed. In an instant, they went past the minor volcanoes they had seen on their way in, and the vegetation soon grew denser around them. The central volcano, which was already impressive seen from afar, was now downright monstrous. The lava sprays that the latter vomited continuously generating a torrid heat that they could feel from their position. At long last, Jake and his group met their first Jake, and he learned the hard way that Shackler's fears were not unfounded. Chapter 592 Wish Granted. Even before reaching the area where Jake had spotted the ether dots cluster, they heard the clash of weapons, gunfire, and emotional yelling of various kinds. It didn't take long for them to figure out who the different cries belonged to. The first type was one of terror or suffering, sometimes tinged with rage after suffering a painful wound or losing one of their precious comrades. The other cries were more bestial and inhuman, many of them reminiscent of the familiar shrill cackles they had learned to abhor and fear. Gobble! Lord Phoenix jumped abruptly as a vibration roused him from his nap. Unlikely as it seemed, he had managed to doze off in Jake's spacesuit. His skull hit the inside of the helmet, and he immediately started to yelp in displeasure. "Fucking bird, will you shut the fuck up?" Shackler vociferated harshly, his eyes bulging with madness. "You want to get us all killed, is that it? You are by far the loudest screamer." Melcree shrugged, staring at him as if he were a rare specimen among morons. This made him snap out of it immediately, but he continued to glare at the turkey in warning. In comparison, Jake and his cat were much more collected. "We came to take a look around and hopefully test our limits," Jake said, ending their bickering. His words sounded wise, but the lust in his eyes told a different story. Shackler gulped for the umpteenth time that day upon witnessing his new master's fighting intent, but if that was enough to shut him up, he was not reassured in the least. Nevertheless, it did not prevent a malicious gleam from flashing in his eyes when the others had their backs turned. "Let's see if you keep giving me that speech in a few minutes. Maybe I'll get my freedom back before nightfall. I'll be the fastest freed slave in history, huh?" Still, the Shirl had a very bad feeling. His faction had only met Jake's clone at the end of their expedition, but they had never ventured this far upstairs. Before they got this far, they would have encountered all sorts of alien and human creatures doped up on the Murtharian bloodline. Where had they all gone? Not having his worries, Jake simply thought he should keep moving. He did, however, give up moving on land to avoid being spotted stupidly. Using his telekinesis and light control this time, Jake lifted his companions off the ground and made them invisible by reflecting light. This stealth mode wasn't perfect, but his ability to accurately reflect the images of the objects behind him was improving every day. Melcree had already become numb from watching these repeated feats. It was as if Jake always had a trick up his sleeve. Shackler, on the other hand, was experiencing these skills for the first, or rather second time, and his anxiety was only growing. Less than a minute later, the group found themselves facing a large river of magma blocking their way. The sounds of the clashes had grown louder as they got closer, and Jake could now make out who the screams belonged to. When he recognized the pain-filled howl of one of them, his expression changed drastically. Will. He didn't like what he heard and began to imagine the worst. It was the first time Melcree and Shackler had seen such a worried expression on this usually relaxed and cynical leader. The force field around him intensified dramatically, causing the air around the group to hum, and they magically accelerated, the river of lava flashing before their eyes in a split second. But just as the group was about to reach the other side, something happened that dashed their hopes. Boom! VVRRRSH. A spindly, high-caliber lava ball split the surface of the water and sniped Jake in the head with the speed of a short-range missile. Even with his telekinetic shield and Silverstone skin activated at the last moment, his head was thrown violently to the side, and the force field allowing them to hover collapsed. Simultaneously, a thick, half-cooled lava whipped through the air in their direction. Then just before impact branched into several vines at its tip that wrapped around their ankles. The portion of the whip buried under the magma exerted a slight tug, and the entire group was dragged into the lava. Splash! The resulting splash was comparable to the explosion of a large bomb, due in part to the relatively high weight of Jake and Crunch. Just before landing in the scorching river, Jake was jolted awake and managed to use his telekinesis to break his comrade's fall, but it was too late to protect them from the lava. Fortunately, Shackler valued his life more than anyone else, and even with his damaged soul, he unleashed all his remaining mana in a powerful ice spell with a pained cry. The group was immediately sealed in a huge block of ice, and it began to sizzle, generating a huge amount of water vapor. "I won't last long, do something." Shiro winced as he held his magic wand in both hands. His abdomen was giving out a stunning aquamarine blue radiance. A faint blue light mingled with his lava veins, giving him unprecedented power, but his gray skin was withering away. On the other hand, the energy radiating from his body was fading fast. Melkree quickly reached out with both hands, and woody roots sprang up and stuck themselves directly into Shackler's back. A pale green halo enveloped the Dryad's body, and this life energy was immediately transferred to the Shiro. But when her energy reached the alien, the young woman's expression changed abruptly. "You're not Al." At that moment, the iceberg in which they were trapped began to sink like a rock, and the Shackler, struggling ardently to save them, became translucent before liquefying a few seconds later. "A clone," Melkree shouted with a flash of understanding. On the lava river's surface, the Real Shackler stood as best he could on an ice raft he had materialized just in time. The ice clone he had created was only a diversion to give the illusion that he was stuck with them. As he felt his connection to his ice doppelganger fade, Shiro let out an evil laugh. "Now all I have to do is take cover and wait to regain my freedom. Thank you, Jake. If it wasn't for your Murtharian body passive, I never would have recovered so much in such a short time." As he gloated like a madman, a thunderous headache far surpassing all previous ones pounded his skull, and he began to convulse on his ice raft. Blue blood began to flow from all his orifices, including his eyes, nostrils, ear, and mouth. "I damaged my soul again." Shackler wasn't laughing anymore. He had never suffered such spiritual injuries, and he was unable to assess their severity. What he didn't know was that they were not recovering as well as he thought they would. "It's all because of this fucking digester. I hope you two kill each other." Shiro had seen Jake get headshot, but he wasn't so naive as to believe that Jake was dead. After all, lava was his element. Everyone else was in danger, but not him. As he was about to turn around and cast an ice bridge at the cost of another bloody coughing fit, the alien suddenly felt the lava beneath him swell, as if a huge bubble was about to burst. "Oh no!" Bang! His ice raft was catapulted into the sky by a huge geyser of lava, and Shackler got his wish: to get out of the lava river as soon as possible. Underneath this deep river of magma, the situation was quite different. Seconds earlier, when Shackler's ice clone had died, Jake had also come to his senses and taken control of the lava around them to prevent it from drowning them. Lava was different from water. In addition to its unbearable temperature, its density was that of the molten rock that made it up. While Jake could easily control a certain amount of it, he also had to deal with the multiple layers of lava piling up above him. Still, he had managed to isolate his group from the magma. Sheltered in a telekinetic bubble, Crunch, who had rolled himself into a ball to protect the turkey and Melkree, popped his head out of his shoulders and cautiously scanned his surroundings. "Are we dead?" He meowed warily as he saw that they were bathed in light. "Not yet, but it won't be long if I don't get us to the surface soon." Jake grunted as he massaged the temple hit by the lava ball. He had a lump as large as a hen's egg there, and that was from protecting himself with his ether and his silverstone skin before impact. "I can't believe there was one ready to ambush us in that river. What the hell was it doing there in the first place?" Crunch complained, shaking his scorched fur without seeming worried in the least. In comparison, Melkree and Lord Phoenix had much more solemn expressions. With her telepathy, the young woman asked Jake, "Is it still here?" That was the question Jake didn't want to hear. His Murtharian eyes were on the lookout, and he was currently watching the enemy with extreme grimness. This thing was swimming around them at breakneck speeds, but with each circle it got a little closer. Suddenly, something hit his telekinetic shield and a stream of lava seeped into the breach before he had time to close it. It is, if you want to survive, be prepared to endure some burns. Chapter 593 Floor Boss. While Jake was preparing for an arduous battle, not far away at the top of a certain volcano, an imposing black orc was also facing a worthy opponent. "Garo, what are you doing here?" Ural chuckled evilly as he recognized the swordsman. I thought you were too busy chasing that old necromancer. Don't tell me he defeated you. He wasn't worried at all. Compared to a few hours ago, the spectacular Garo had lost his poise. His long-sleeved coat hiding his hands was a distant memory, and even his tight-fitting black armor was a wreck good for the garbage. A long gash now crossed his face, its repulsive sight reminiscent of a cauterized red-hot wound. His long aquamarine sword, however, still hung faithfully on his belt. Perceiving the orc's mocking tone, the young warrior's starry double pupil filled irises rested coldly on him. I smell despair on you, but it is not from you, but from the souls you have consumed. Garo proclaimed regally as he slowly drew his sword, a murderous aura surging wildly from his body. Those who spread evil like you must be eradicated, no matter what the cost. The smirk faded from the black orc's face, and a hard, icy expression transformed his features. When he opened his mouth, the words that flowed out were closer to the growl of a ferocious beast than that of a civilized humanoid. I have nothing against you, Garo, but if you dare to stand in my way, I will not hesitate to kill you. I'm not puny and arrogant like that Nelakai jerk. When I strike, I don't miss. Oh, the human's eyes widened slightly as he perceived the incredible confidence behind that statement. Far from intimidating him, it only strengthened his desire to fight this orc. His fight against Nelakai had been unsatisfactory and prematurely interrupted, but he hoped this one would give him full satisfaction. Unfortunately, it was all a dream as long as the main troublemaker was still running free. Ruoer. Sigh? There it goes again. Garo shook his head with a weary, dejected look on his face. Unmotivated, he put away his sword and walked off in a downcast manner in another direction, completely ignoring the orc. Ural's expression also changed upon hearing the roar. A dungeon boss? But why is it so strong? I can feel its ether fluctuation from here. He had his reasons to be shocked. On the way, he had personally taken out a boss from the second and third floor. These monsters were several notches above their fellows, so much so that it was scary, but not for Ural. With his strength, the orc was confident he could take out the bosses on the fourth and maybe even fifth floor without worry. After all, he was in the top tier of sixth ordeal evolvers. His equipment was excellent, and he had collected a considerable number of souls since entering the dungeon. His current power had far surpassed that of the day before. That was part of the reason why he was so confident in facing Garo. Idiot, the swordsman spat with disdain. He's not just a boss, but a floor boss. In the previous floors, there were many passages to the lower floors. The bosses you defeated were just their guards. Maybe you felt amazing, but you didn't accomplish anything. The rules are different here. There is only one volcano leading to the fifth floor. In other words, there's only one boss. The floor boss. Ural sensed that there was something fishy about this speech. Wanting an explanation, he shouted at Garo. Even if that's the case, we're here for the Nexus, right? If we can't defeat a simple digester that the dungeon created, what are we all doing here? The swordsman turned his head towards him and gave him a baleful look. I return the question to you. I don't know. You're too late anyway. The others are too far ahead of you. Ruer. The monster was closing in fast. Wanting a real answer, Ural stopped the swordsman by firmly gripping his shoulder, but this was not to the liking of this human. Frowning imperceptibly, Garo pulled away with a sudden jerk of his torso and started walking again. This time the orc did not try to stop him. Just before he blended into the background to reach another volcano, Garo sent him a telepathic warning. If you want your answer, fight it. Who knows? Maybe you're as strong as you think you are, and the rest of us are incompetent. Ural hesitated for a long time about attacking Garo, but he gave up. A third roar, even closer than the previous one, made him realize that it was too late to run away anyway. He had never intended to anyway. If I can't kill you, I can at least see what you're made of. At last the floor boss appeared, and if the black orc was slightly surprised by his appearance, it didn't shake his thirst for battle. In doing so, however, he did not realize that he was playing into the hands of those other high-rank evolvers who were waiting for their chance to slip in unnoticed. Bang, bang, bang. Jake was as focused as ever, a bead of sweat dripping from his forehead as he poured all his energy into keeping his shield intact. The things swimming in the lava had become more and more aggressive and daring as the seconds passed, and he had already intercepted several hundred lava bullets and other, even more vicious and destructive projectiles. Melkree had already been buried under a thick layer of bark and looked more like a treant than a dryad. Even so, the smell of burning wood was spreading rapidly through their protective little bubble, and even Crunch was panting heavily to get rid of the excess heat. The turkey had already passed out. Without Jake's protection, he would have died by now. It was true that Jake could not avoid his own bloodline/ether spells. It was like a human shooting another human with a gun at close range. He could, of course, anticipate these attacks to some extent, but the circumstances were different. Here he had to protect his comrades as well. If he was alone, he could easily defend himself. His silverstone skin was more than enough to resist his lava bullets and wind blades. It was as if a normal human had an inch or two of pure steel coating on his skin to protect him from a single bullet. Yet there was nothing he could do for his allies except waste his ether core energy and stamina. Jake seemed tireless, but that was because he relied mostly on his telekinesis, the power of which was fixed and proportional to his mental strength and physical abilities. The truth was that telekinesis wasn't an ether spell per se. He couldn't increase its power on a whim. His ether core could power his other bloodline spells, including his heat, radiation, and earth control, but compared to his ether stats, his ether core wasn't worth mentioning. By spreading his mind around a few meters, he could easily pick up as much if not more ether to power his spells. Jake could speed up his rotation to draw ether toward him to some extent, which he was already doing, but it also meant that ultimately the flow of ether available for his spells was fixed. When an enemy managed to force him to mobilize both his telekinesis and ether core to their maximum power, he was left with only a couple of options to increase the power of his magic. The first was what the novice ether manipulation manual called ether core reversing. By reversing the rotation of the ether core and greedily pulling on it with his spirit body, it was possible to forcibly extract the ether absorbed throughout his cultivation. Instead of settling for the crumbs that the ether core deigned to radiate, he could then access the millions, billions of ether points that the ether core had gobbled up in order to release a meager dividend of 406 points. For obvious reasons, this was his last choice. It was, however, the main reason why the Etherists were so feared. If they were pushed to their limits, they could do crazy things. The older they got, the more dizzying the accumulation of ether became. The second solution was to provide the energy required for his ether and bloodline spells by drawing on his own body and his environment. At level 3, his heat, radiation, and earth control allowed him to absorb and control these energy sources to feed his cells or cast other spells. The third solution was bloodline ignition, which would instantly double the power of his bloodline, but at the cost of extreme cellular and mental stress, as well as a slight change in character. Jake could endure these side effects to some extent, but he preferred to reserve this for the most urgent situations. Beyond these three solutions, he still had as internal resources the ether stored in his ether soul core and cells, and as external resources his ether sun core and purgatory. Right now, Jake was using a mixture of the second and third solutions. He had begun to sacrifice his stamina to strengthen his control of the lava around him. In addition to the telekinetic barrier, any lava entering within 10 meters would immediately fall under his control. That was why, even with their extreme inertia, no lava bullets had managed to get past his shield. But this plan could not last forever. No matter how good his control of the lava was, he could not make the heat disappear. His body had a conversion limit, and if he tried to cool the lava by absorbing that heat into his own body, he might succeed, but his body would become hot as a sun, ruining the very purpose of his action. When even Crunch began to suffocate, Jake made his decision. A small object resembling a mini-city appeared in his hand, and he mouthed, "Let's see if this 7th-generation spaceship is as cool as it sounds." Chapter 594, Fighting Oneself, Part 1. As soon as Jake linked his mind to the purgatory, everything around him disappeared except for his allies. For a brief moment, he found the fantasy and very personal landscape of the purgatory dream, and he even saw his digester clone for the first time. The climatic and environmental conditions were not so different from the 4th floor as they were optimal for those of his bloodline. But Jake had no intention of fighting his doppelganger here. even though it was the ideal ground. His companions could not afford to wait any longer. With a thought, he activated the spaceship mode, which was really just an alternate manifestation of the Purgatory dream. In its database was the blueprint of a 7th-generation consortium interstellar battleship, and this was just an illusion like everything else his bronze artifact could create. Yet it was precisely what he needed. As long as these illusory constructs remained within the realm of the Purgatory, they were as real could be. There was something different about this illusion, though. It was not another dimension superimposed on reality, but an illusion arising in the real world. The consequences on the lava river would have dire consequences for the digesters and evolvers nearby. In the blink of an eye, the volcanic landscape vanished as well, and a floor and walls of dark, sleek metal replaced it, spreading like a virus around them. Jake and his group soon found themselves in the cockpit of a vast spaceship several hundred meters long. The cockpit they were in was as large as a tennis court, and there were all sorts of screens, holograms, machines, and other devices for a competent crew. Jake obviously didn't know how to drive this ship model, or any other for that matter, but he didn't need to. She was here to take care of this. She downloaded her consciousness into the ship and immediately took over the controls. A steady stream of bluish plasma was spewed out of the rear and wing ramjets, while an energy shield enveloped the ship to neutralize and repel the lava heating the ship's armor. This energy shield lived up to its billing. Once activated, the ship's plating temperature remained completely stable. She then prepared for takeoff by rotating the ramjet's outlets toward the ground. A powerful acceleration force pinned them to the ground, followed by a violent tremor that nearly sent them tumbling to the ground. "Hang on," Jake shouted, using his telekinesis to steady himself. Crunch dug his claws into a seat to hold on, while Melcree wrapped her roots around a console. "Be careful, Jake. The digester is inside the ship." She's warning caught him off guard as the ship began its ascent. Jake had considered the possibility, but the warning came at the worst possible time. He hadn't yet learned how to sort out intruders on activation, and he was about to pay the price. One of the holograms mapping the interior of the ship displayed several green dots corresponding to their position and another red only a few meters away from them. Shit. Vroom. The ship took off with a phenomenal bang, pushing up the lava above them, but Jake and his group were unaware that outside a disaster had already struck. As soon as the ship had popped out of nowhere, the space originally occupied by the lava had been violently replaced by a metal object of tens of thousands of cubic meters. The lava that was once there had not disappeared, but had been violently displaced outwards. The inevitable consequence was a cataclysmic lava tsunami. Coming back to the present, this was what Shaktler was currently experiencing firsthand. Long before the ship began its takeoff, the ill-intentioned alien had already been dispatched to other skies. Meanwhile, inside the ship, Jake was struggling with his clone. As the ship accelerated rapidly, his digester doppelganger had sneaked up behind them, and by the time he received She's warning, it was too late. Boom! The strobe light from the alarm sirens threw the interior of the ship into chaos, and Jake had a hard time locating the alien. A lava bullet pierced Melcree's heart from behind, burning a huge hole in her chest. Crunch was not spared either, but his hardened fur withstood the blow. As for the kinetic energy of the projectile, it was neutralized by his rubber flesh. In the end, he was left with a horrible burn, but his life was not in danger. Jake also was treated to a lava bullet, but the digester had clearly set his priorities. Whether it was his predatory instincts or just intelligence, he understood that Jake was the most dangerous of the group. If he could eliminate the others, he could then focus on this tough prey. Jake deflected the bullet with his own force field, then took control of it and sent it back to the sender with twice its original speed. The digester wasn't expecting this counterattack, and he took it in the face. The heat was nothing to the creature, but the impact shook his head back violently. For a second, Jake thought he had defeated the monster, but a silvery sheen on the alien's forehead quickly changed his mind. Like him earlier, the digester had used his own silverstone skin to survive the headshot. The monster then unleashed a barrage of lava bullets drawing on its own stamina, and Jake calmly parried, neutralizing each projectile by absorbing their heat, before sending the cooled projectile back at the alien. The digester was still young and inexperienced, but he had the stats to compensate. His intelligence was as terrifying as Jake's. He could multitask, and his brain was highly efficient and adaptive. Accustomed to swimming and fighting in lava, this was the first time he was forced to fight outside of his preferred environment, and he had already realized that shooting lava bullets without lava nearby was draining his strength quickly. Creating solid matter out of nothing, even the more powerful evolvers would not venture into that territory. It wasn't that it was impossible, but depending on the energy system used to fight, the cost could quickly become astronomical. Neither Jake nor his digester counterpart had reached the level to spam lava spells created out of thin air. Panting slightly, the creature swept its gaze over the metal walls around it, and Jake, with a curious expression, or rather his mind, perceived psychic impulses running through the ship. It wasn't on the level of an oracle scan, but it sure looked like one. The alien let out a shrill cackle as it realized that the lava hadn't really disappeared. It was just outside. While Jake, and even a relatively mature human, would have chosen to fight in other ways, the digester opted for the plan that seemed most obvious: destroy the ship. Bam! The monster rammed itself into one of the walls, speeding up its run with telekinesis, and Jake watched dumbly as his clone wasted his energy on a metal illusion. During his third ordeal, he too had dealt with this kind of steel on several occasions, and while it wasn't indestructible, it was stronger than it looked, especially the outer armor of the ship. By the time the digester managed to melt and sink a tiny portion, the ship had surfaced above the river of lava, and the metal behemoth soared majestically into the sky like some humongous monster. Shriek. Maddened by the sight of the structure resisting its claws and teeth, the alien let out a shrill cry that shattered their eardrums, but she continued to maneuver the ship to the other side. When they reached it, Jake deactivated the purgatory and stowed the artifact, his mission accomplished. Melkri, Crunch, and Lord Phoenix were gently waved away behind him, clearing the battlefield of their presence. The Dryad was not dead. A tree didn't really have a heart. However, she was badly wounded again. She needed a few minutes to recover. Now that Jake had his feet back on solid ground and a bright sun shining on his back, he could finally get a good look at the digester that Shackler had mistaken him for and that had left him so traumatized. With the ship gone, the alien also stopped raging futilely and turned to the only human present, who bore an uncanny resemblance to him. The human and the digester stared into each other's eyes, studying each other, and the same astonishment could be seen inside. The digester looked 90% like him. His body was exactly the same in size, proportion, musculature, and hair. His hair was also a mixture of gold and silver, as was the glow in his irises. A network of lava veins dotted the surface of his skin, and his translucent claws and fangs were also identical to hers. Where the monster stood out, proudly displaying its digester heritage, was in its grayish, translucent skin color and the silver chitin exoskeleton covering its body. Still, the monster was shirtless, wearing only a straight shoulder pad, leggings and boots covered with sharp spikes, and reinforced gauntlets. This clone doesn't look as terrifying as I imagined. Jake wore a disappointed expression. Ambushed under the lava and forced to protect his allies, he had found this enemy nightmarish, but now that he saw it without any filter, the creature looked immature and inexperienced. Only its stats seemed to match or even surpass his own, but the difference was not obvious. If that's all it is, then killing you is no longer of any interest, Jake said as he unsheathed his bone-crushing snowworm's fong for the first time. Baiting the monster with a wave of his hand, he commanded, "Bring it on." Chapter 595, Fighting Oneself, Part 2. The monster, closely resembling him, didn't make him ask twice. Roar. A sound blast exploded from its mouth, revealing its long, translucent fangs in the process. Jake snorted, but stood still, letting the shockwave pass through him without flinching. His gold and silver hair was briefly slicked back, flapping as the gust of wind swept through it before falling down smoothly. Then, Jake pointed 2 fingers at the creature's left eye, forming a gun with his hand, and an air bullet condensed with his mind hit the digester's forehead with a resounding bang. Like earlier, his head was thrown back, but his forehead was covered with a film of metal. When the sparks from the impact disappeared, the metal layer disappeared, but his clone was no longer roaring with anger. If it hadn't tilted its head an inch to the side, the air bullet would have pierced its eye and reached his brain. For the first time, the alien realized that he was not invincible, but its intelligence was also exceptional. With a confused but excited look on its face, it also pointed 2 fingers at Jake, and an intangible force began to condense the air in front of it, attempting to form its own wind bullet. Jake noticed right away that the digester was a fast learner, and he had no intention of giving him time to perfect his skills. Although his family claimed to be smarter and more talented than their peers, Jake had never felt exceptional. Even with his current stats, he had always thought that what he could do, others could do as well, especially a clone. Most of his techniques were not even secret moves. He had barely trained, and most of them had been improvised on the fly. They were just an application of his bloodline abilities and high stats. A kid could have the same IQ as an adult with a PhD, but could he make up for decades of study with a little creativity and dedication? Of course not. Although this digester had a great deal of intelligence and learned freakingly fast, it would also take time to accomplish the same feats as Jake. But it was only if this thing was human in the first place. Digesters had other ways to improve, and the truth was that Jake had not trained his skills for years, but a few hours at most. If he didn't do something, this monster would soon match him, and by showing him his techniques, it was like Jake was teaching him for free. "I won't let you copy me," Jake said, tapping the ground with his foot. His figure disappeared from its original location, leaving a footprint 3 inches deep in the rock, and he reappeared in front of his clone, crouching slightly and leaning forward, his long serrated sword scraping the ground behind him. Everything happened at lightning speed. His left foot shifted slightly, sinking into the ground for better support. His right foot pushed the ground backwards, pumping all his power into his knees, then rotating his pelvis and shoulders. The contracted arms, congested with blood, followed the movement, and an invisible force field accelerated the upward sword strike aimed directly at the insertion between the blow and the throat. If the slashing stroke hit, the head would be transversely cleaved in 2. Without even consciously trying to form an air blade, a sharp, paper-thin wind preceded his sword blade, nearly decapitating the monster. The digester's eyes bulged out and his hair subconsciously bristled with fear, but his fighting instincts proved their worth at that very moment. At the last moment, his chin hardened, covering itself with a thick growth of silver chitin, the silverstone skin fully activated. Perhaps because he was panicking, or because it was a matter of life and death, the digester activated the silverstone skin all over his body, and plates of chitin began to cover the rest of his exposed face in a last-ditch attempt to survive. Simultaneously, his torso and neck tilted back, and he lifted his chin, the sharp wind before the actual assault only grazing him and producing a spray of sparks. Jake and his Murtharian sight could see exactly what the creature was trying to accomplish, and his galactic eyes, scrutinizing its every move in slow motion, missed nothing of its counter-moves. His hands corrected their angle slightly, tilting the blade back in the proper direction to meet the digester's throat. At the same time, a soul arrow shot out from his forehead, stabbing straight into his foes. The alien froze imperceptibly before resuming his dodge, but it was already too late. The bone-crushing snowworm's fang hit its target, and true to its name, the digester's mandible shattered into pieces. The serrated blade continued its oblique ascent, its teeth ripping flesh, teeth, ganglia, bones, and a piece of brain off in the process. Jake thought he had a sure win, but he underestimated his opponent, or rather himself. When his blade hit the brain stem, all the lifelong fury of his clone exploded at once. His body turned into a human torch, shining as bright as a sun, and an explosion of heat, radiation, and telekinesis deflected the blade from its intended purpose. Wrapped in flames and a deadly aura, the humanoid creature leapt into the air 100 feet in the air, and a red beam condensed inside its mangled jaw before bombarding Jake, still in the same posture below. Jake, who had protected himself in time with a telekinetic shield, looked coldly at his enemy, lifting his head and raising his saber to intercept the attack. With a precise flick of his blade, Jake reflected the red beam right back at his creator using a Jedi move. The beam struck the monster's chest, but a silver chitin breastplate blocked it. The dreadful heat spread to the biological material, making it glow slightly, but it was nothing compared to the temperature of the white-hot flames enveloping its body. The alien's body temperature continued to rise, releasing vast amounts of energy, and its half-ripped face began to regenerate. Jake frowned at the monster's stubbornness. If it were him, he would surely have chosen to retreat to a safe place to recover. Instead, this digester had chosen to sacrifice its internal energy to generate the environment it needed to heal as quickly as possible. While this worked in practice, the consequences were also predictable. The alien began to melt away visibly, the little fat, and then his muscles deflating like a burst balloon. Jake even had the distinct impression that the digester was becoming smaller. "It's my chance." Unaware of its state, his clone charged at him, its feet and arms jetting out flames to propel itself even faster. On the verge of death, the digester seemed to have awakened its full potential, and for the first time Jake saw his clone employing moves that he himself had never thought to use until now. The Human Torch shortened the distance in a fraction of a second, its body now completely hidden under a dense chitin exoskeleton, and the tips of its upper limbs suddenly morphed into a long blade and a round shield. The shield parried Jake's saber as his blade stabbed into the shield itself. Jake was taken aback by this absurd move, but when the silver shield opened up in the middle like a sea splitting open to let the blade through, his face petrified with shock. This stabbing stroke was going straight for his left eye. Like his clone earlier, Jake tilted his head back, followed by his neck and torso. His body had long since been reinforced by his silverstone skin, while his telekinetic barrier had always been active. His Murtharian eyes were also on the lookout for the slightest surprise, and that was the difference between day and night. Instead of losing himself in an uncontrolled dodging motion, his neck and torso moved minimally. His head tilted slightly to the side. Then he swung it to the right to narrowly avoid the blow, the digester's blade grazing his left cheek. Also like Jake, the clone tried to adjust its blow along the way, switching from a stabbing stroke to a downward slashing swing in an attempt to cut his pelvis in half. Jake was also ready, and another soul arrow shot out of his forehead, stunning the alien again. He sidestepped, managing to move behind the alien with his sword dancing beautifully in its wake. A spray of silver blood painted the sky, and a head that looked disturbingly like him rolled to the ground. His clone was dead. When Jake was about to savor his victory, Shaktalar, whom he didn't expect to see again anytime soon, emerged terrified from the side of a nearby volcano, running like hell, tongue hanging out. His new robe was in tatters, a few flames still licking its ends, and the Shirl looked even worse. The terror on his face mixed with his sobs, making him even more ugly and disgusting than he already was. His traumatized barking was auditory torture for Jake and his comrades present, but the most delicate of music for the digester pursuing him. When Jake saw the thing following him, he froze. Confirming his fears, the digester identical to the one he had just killed looked down and burst out laughing, its deep, booming voice making his soul tremble. "Are you proud that you killed a pale copy of me? Let me show you what a true Murtharian digester is truly capable of." Chapter 596 Big Brother. It can speak. Jake should have expected it, having heard some of the goblin and orc digesters babbling a few nonsensical lines, but amazingly, he was still shocked. For one thing, his other clone hadn't uttered a single word, but more importantly, they had the same voice. The digester's voice seemed to have a certain reverb, as if he were speaking into a microphone, but it was still his own voice, albeit dehumanized. If the previous clone he had just killed could be considered his retarded gray twin with amnesia, this newcomer was more like a sociopathic older brother. They were still as similar as two peas in a pod, but this time Jake was the punier of the two. This digester was a head taller than he was. It may have seemed like an insignificant detail, but this thing had his silver Murtharian bloodline. With his growth and increase in body stats tending to decelerate, a head difference meant that his clone was most likely at least twice as strong as him. But even so, Jake didn't consider running away for a second. He had just prevailed against himself, and his confidence was on fire. It was his most unreliable Myrmidian trait kicking in at the worst possible moment. As if to encourage him, Jake distinctly felt his ether stats spike, and his spirit body even rose to level 19 after a long stagnation at level 18. His clone didn't drop anything, but that was precisely why he was ready to face this even stronger newcomer. The sheer fright and pitiful state of Shackler did not make him doubt either. He'd had confirmation of that with the clone he'd just killed. They had his powers, but not his memories or experience. Heck, the dead digester couldn't even shift his ether correctly to strengthen or speed up his attacks. That was how Jake had chopped his head off, slipping into his blind spot without the alien being able to react. Even though this clone looks stronger, if it's like the last one, it's doable. Jake made up his mind, but the way he clenched the hilt of his saber gave away that his instincts were not aligned with his thoughts. After all, there was something unique about this one. Seeing Jake raise his weapon in a defensive posture, the clone chuckled again. Ugh, another brother of mine? No, this one is different. His skin is not gray like ours. Is it an original? Jake and the others listened to the alien monologue with a guarded expression, especially Shackler, who had taken advantage of the respite to keep running. Come back here, Jake ordered stoically without giving the Shirl a glance. Upon hearing the order, the ice mage stumbled and his legs braked against his will. Unable to resist, he turned around and obediently started walking back to his master. And no, please let me go. It's just suicide. The alien whined with a deranged grimace distorting his face. All the more reason to keep you as a meat shield by my side. Jake smiled, but his gaze was still riveted on his clone. Ruer. A terrifying roar exploded several kilometers away from them coming from the central volcano, causing a small earthquake and several landslides. The remaining lava at the bottom of the river a few meters away from them rose about 10 meters like a geyser, but did not fall back immediately, giving the impression that a curtain of lava had just been drawn. The cooling lava from the tsunami that had ravaged the surrounding land when Jake had summoned his spaceship instantly turned white-hot again, and some particles were plucked from it, all converging towards a certain spot inside the crater of that same volcano. What the hell was that? Jake looked at his arm and found that he had goosebumps. I'm afraid. Even more jarring, the clone digester in front of him was sporting the same gravity. No more time for fun. I'm sorry for my brothers, but it's survival of the fittest. Whether you're the original or not, you have to die so I can live longer. Jake wasn't sure he understood all of his insinuations, but he didn't need to. For when his clone made this statement, an overwhelming spiritual pressure fell upon them. Crack. The rocky ground beneath his feet cracked, and his legs buckled imperceptibly before he could pull himself up. The lava particles caught by the roarer in the distance crashed back to the ground, and the few plants and trees present creaked. Gravity. Jake lost his composure for the first time. He didn't know how to do that. At first he rationalized the situation as telekinesis, but he changed his mind when he saw that this gravitational field was affecting absolutely everything within 60 meters. Glancing behind him, he saw that Melcree had turned back into a sapling to speed up her recovery and was unable to move, while the turkey still hadn't regained consciousness. The addition of this gravitational field combined with this spiritual pressure suggested the worst. Shackler, protect Melcree. Crunch, take the bird to a safe place and try to find the others. Meow. Crunch nodded. Then his body squeezed in on itself, forming multiple folds of fat, and when he released the tension, his body was catapulted into the air at supersonic speed, escaping the gravitational pull in a blink. Why am I the one who has to protect Melcree? Shackler grumbled in despair, 2 streams of tears silently running down his face. Jake didn't care about his slave's moods. Once his orders were given, his mind turned entirely to the clone in front of him. He could feel it. This foe was something else. His own killing intent pulsed forth from his body, his will to fight consolidating until it was almost palpable. Slowly, but surely, he activated all his amplification skills. Warrior Silver Murtharian Trance, on. His body stats were instantly quadrupled, the highest allowed at level 3. His body heat increased distinctly, and a faint golden aura surrounded him. Warrior Silver Murtharian skill, on. The clone in front mirrored him, audibly repeating the name of the technique as if to mock his efforts. Spiritual Silver Murtharian Trance, on. Jake muttered inwardly without letting himself be provoked. The power and sturdiness of his spirit body was also multiplied by 4. The same faint golden aura, but with lighter tones wrapped around his spirit body, as well as the ether soul core lodged between his eyes. His Murtharian eyes began to glow ominously with many stars. Spiritual silver Murtharian trance, on. The digester growled scornfully. This time the alien beat him to it. His already gray and ribbed skin took on a metallic sheen, and the chitin exoskeleton, already forming a perfect armor on his body, extended like liquid metal to his face except for his eyes, forming a complete armor without any flaws. The transformation went even further than that, and Jake saw pipe-like gross form on the top of his gauntlets and behind his elbows. There were many other oddities on this chitin armor, but when he saw a stream of plasma jetting out of it, he understood. Unwilling to be intimidated, Jake tried to emulate this, but to no avail. The surface of his body, including his skin and hair, turned metallic except for his eyes. The metal layer grew thicker, especially around his throat, neck, face, chest, and other vulnerable areas, forming a second natural armor, but the result was paltry compared to what his clone had just pulled off. Still, Jake looked a little more like his digester clone now. Silverstone skin on. Jake gritted his teeth as he stared at his clone. Seeing that his opponent was finished with his preparations, the clone tilted his head and sneered. That's it. That's it. I got carried away for nothing, it seems. Let me show you then. Gravitational field on. Heat, light, earth, metal enhancement on. Aura of vitality on. Energy shield on. Invisibility on. Jake's face flinched as he watched his clone activate an endless list of buffing spells, some of which he had never heard of before. However, he resisted the urge to escalate things with bloodline ignition or his purgatory. They were his last resort. The Ether Sun core would be of no use against his clone, at least not at close range. When Jake could, he tried to mimic his clone, but he soon realized he couldn't do it. Not in a combat situation. For example, he didn't really have an invisibility skill. The one he had learned to use on his own exploited his light manipulation skill to pull off this lopsided spell. It wasn't something he could activate by flicking a switch. When his clone finally stopped spouting new spells, silence returned, but the suffocating tension reached its peak. Jake clutched his saber's hilt, and the clone did the same, swinging a heavy greatsword that he had the courtesy to flaunt before turning it invisible as well. With his ether vision, this invisibility didn't really matter, but it added an extra hassle to deal with in the coming fight. This would be the first time Jake would have to fight while dealing with both levels of vision. They stared at each other for a few more seconds, and Jake sprang into action first, taking the initiative. The only thing he managed to hear before spewing his guts out while flying in the opposite direction was Shackler shrieking in a panic. Don't fight him head on, oh my god. Chapter 597 Dead? Jake's body flashed by for half a kilometer at a speed nearly impossible to follow with the naked eye until a natural obstacle brought its course to an end, another volcano. A human crevice was carved into the side of the same volcano, followed by a landslide, then a massive rock fall. Jake was completely buried underneath in front of a horrified Shackler. After yelling, he held his breath, praying for a miracle, but reality quickly caught up with him. Is he dead? Shirl wondered, far from experiencing the thrill he should have felt upon regaining his freedom. Probing his body carefully, then his oracle status, he immediately pulled himself together with a conflicted expression. He's still alive. I don't know if I should be happy or sad. From now on, Shackler would have to worry about the digester a few meters away from him. With Jake out of the picture, he would soon be the target again. After the lava river had burst its banks, the alien had thought he was doomed and had summoned all the mana in his ice mana core to save himself. Shortly thereafter, he had bumped into that clone and his heart had skipped a beat when the digester had recognized him and guffawed. Jejij, you're the vermin that escaped earlier. I'm glad you came back so I can rectify my mistake. The Shirl didn't know what he was hoping for when he ran to Jake, but certainly not this. To survive these few seconds against the digester, he had sacrificed his last ice pearl, an item he had found in his fourth ordeal. His precious magic staff had also been destroyed, and he had long since used up his rare mana potions. Now he was basically naked and penniless. His soul was so damaged that it was about to disintegrate, and his headache was so excruciating that he couldn't even control his mana, let alone his ether. His body could still move, but he couldn't even focus on guiding his legs. When the Murtharian digester turned his head to finish the job, Shackler's heart sank, but he also stopped struggling. When he accepted his fate, his fear also left him. Paradoxically, he felt better. If I concentrate with all my heart, I can still use one ice spell, but my soul will explode. Even if I survive, I will probably have the IQ of a Nawai male after that. As he prepared to die in a final blaze, the rubble of the other volcano's rockslide began to shake. A force field from below suddenly burst through them, and the rocks began to vibrate as they slowly rose into the air. A disheveled, dust-covered male figure emerged from the rubble, looking dark and angry. The digester, who was about to eliminate Shackler, promptly turned his attention back to the human he thought was the original. Ugh, still alive? I should have expected that from someone who looks just like me. Jake spat out a bloody gob in response, pounding his chest with his fist to force himself to cough up what was obstructing his airways. His wound was initially much more serious, the edge of the enemy's blade having struck from under his pectoral muscles, collapsing his lungs and shattering his ribcage in the process. His heart had been spared, but his aorta artery had been severed, momentarily cutting off the blood flow to his brain and arms. Had he not directed his constitution and vitality ether into the damaged area at the last moment, he would have been sliced in half. Upon slamming into the volcano, he didn't get up immediately, taking advantage of the landslide to summon his Ether Sun core to melt the rock around him and heal his wounds. With the local ether density, Jake's real vitality was almost 4,000 times that of a human. With his healing skill, the support of this terrain, and his Ether Sun core, he was virtually unkillable if he wasn't killed in one hit. The problem was that this was true for his opponent as well. Whatever, I'll just fight him first. Jake cracked his neck with a grunt from the pain. The landing had also fractured a few vertebrae in him. Shackler, keep protecting Melkri. Jake called the Shirel back to order as he watched him remain transfixed in amazement. Sure, the alien obeyed meekly without nitpicking for the first time. This unexpected burst of hope had made him lose his voice. Jake gave up any idea of hand-to-hand combat. Their first exchange had made him realize that whatever he could do, his clone could do better. The digester was faster, stronger, and more agile, not to mention having to deal with his invisibility as well. There was only one area in which neither of them could quickly stand out, and that was their tenacity. To test the waters, he fired a first burst of air bullets at his clone. The digester didn't budge, his telekinetic shield intercepting these bullets without showing any sign of weakness. Jake followed up with a large air blade, patiently condensing until the air itself began to hum. But the result was the same. The force field around the alien coalesced around the wind blade with a few fluctuations, but nothing more. Jake hesitated for a long time about his next move, but he wasn't sure what he could improvise on the spot that would work. These wind spells were fancy moves, but an air blade could not logically outperform a real steel blade at equal speed. Fire and lava spells were also out of the question, unless he could generate so much heat that not even a Murtharian could withstand it. For the next few seconds, his clone mockingly let him test a lot of combinations, more or less innovative, but nothing worked. Fire, light, lava, earth, metal, none of these elements controlled as he did could break through the digester's perfect defense. Of course, this was by not tapping into his stamina. However, there were some techniques that gave him some hope. When he sped up one of the steel needles made during his second ordeal with his telekinesis and a blast of heat, the projectile effortlessly pierced the enemy's immaterial barrier. Had the clone not intercepted it with his sword, he might have been injured. Another time, he did the same by accelerating a bazooka warhead stored in the faction vault by will. The result was even better. Not knowing what he was dealing with, his clone interpreted the nature of this object as that of a bigger needle than the previous one, and his sword swung up with the same nonchalance. The resulting explosion and shockwave created a crater the size of a basketball court. When the dust settled, his clone stood unharmed with his guard up in a defensive posture, but the residual shrapnel had cut into his chitin exoskeleton. So, I can't play fair if I want to win. What Jake didn't realize was that his clone was learning as he did. So far, he had defeated many of his clones to evolve to the point where he was, and he had always been the most talented. Over time, he had also killed other evolvers, sometimes acquiring their techniques. Some of his clones also had their own specialties. Thanks to Jake, the digester had just discovered the dangers of technology. At the same time, Jake knew that because of his intelligence, what worked once had no chance of working a second time. His next attack, he would go all out. Alas, his clone wasn't his clone for nothing. What the monster was thinking at that moment was something like, if I let him fool me a third time, I will die? I must attack first. And so he did. As Jake mentally conditioned himself to attempt a combination he had never dared to use, his clone beat him to it. Before he blinked, the digester was standing almost 400 meters away from him. When he opened his eyes again, Jake saw the air distort in front of him because of his clone who had just teleported. Fuck. Jake urgently teleported a few feet away, but the clone stomped violently on the ground, and the alien reappeared in front of him with an upward swing. His blade only half raised. Jake teleported again, this time behind his opponent, and twirled backward. As if he had eyes in the back of his head, the alien leaned his torso to the right while contorting himself, then rolled to the ground while stretching his back legs in a double kick. His left leg deflected Jake's blade, while his right foot struck Jake's plexus, knocking the breath out of him and sending him flying. As Jake rose in a parabolic curve, his clone reappeared above him and hacked him down with his own invisible greatsword. Feeling his death approaching like a wild beast facing a super predator, Jake applied telekinesis to his own belly to throw himself to the ground, while his palms blasted a blinding jet of flame to hasten his fall just a little more. Despite this, the invisible blade was inexorably closing in on his chest, and in a moment of dazzling lucidity, Jake met his clone's cold gaze and retaliated with a Murtharian soul beam, one of his only seasoned eye techniques. The result? The digester didn't even slow down, his swing even accelerating in the process. Instead, a flash of infrared radiation hit his retinas and a mind-bending pain shot through his skull, electrifying his spirit body and his entire soul. Damn it! His vision blurred, and when it stabilized again, he was pinned to the ground, unable to feel his legs. Chapter 598 Impossible? For a second, Jake thought his body had been cleaved in half at the waist, but the vision of horror he was envisioning did not come true. When he lifted his head to examine his body, he was pleased to find that his body was still in one piece. Phew. Nevertheless, his spine had indeed snapped on impact, and his entire abdominal girdle had been ripped open by a broad blade with seemingly blunt edges. He had no trouble identifying the guilty weapon. Although invisible, his clone was wielding one that met the criteria. Despite his delight at getting away with so little damage, Jake was nonetheless puzzled. He knew what his body was capable of, and when his clone had hacked him down, he should have ended up as a bloody pulp on the rocky ground. Spreading his mental sense, Jake discovered not without surprise that the liquid alloy he usually stored in his space storage had been summoned without his knowledge. Several tons of liquid metal had cushioned his fall, and he was now bathing in a sort of small pool that looked half solid and half viscous. Where his lower abdomen had been sliced, there was no trace of liquid alloy, but Jake didn't need to rack his brains to figure out how he had been saved. Validating his theory, he heard She's agitated voice chiding him in his head. I saved you this time, overstepping my rights, but it can't happen again. What do you mean? Jake raised an eyebrow as he perceived her serious mood. Look above you instead. Jake looked up at the sky and finally remembered that he was in the middle of a fight. Even though their conversation had taken place in a split second, he had literally been incapacitated for several seconds straight. Even now, he was in no condition to fight. That should have been more than enough time for the digester to finish him off. As he saw his clone hovering above him, he understood the reason. This fucking asshole. Jake gritted his teeth in fury and humiliation. The liquid alloy that had saved his life. His clone was using his own metal manipulation to seize control of it. Long metallic filaments were billowing upward toward both of the alien's clasped hands, and Jake could see the precious material being siphoned off by it, as if this digester's body were a sponge. Furiously scanning his space storage, the liquid alloy forming a mattress underneath him and the inside of his own body. Jake discovered that this thief had already stolen 4 to 5 tons of the 27 in his possession. I can't let him keep robbing me like this. Grunting miserably, Jake forced himself to use his telekinesis to reconnect his spine, then poured all his vitality ether into the injured area to speed up his healing. With his own vitality and the help of the environment, Jake immediately reconnected with his legs. As soon as he could move, he focused all of his willpower to regain control of his liquid alloy and with one thought reabsorbed it into his space storage. He kept a few pounds to coat his skull with a metallic film to protect himself from psychic attacks. Now that he knew his clone was stronger than he was, he had to play it safe. Despite his quick action, the digester still snatched about 7 tons. This was the biggest loss Jake had suffered since his debut in the Mirror Universe. Did he intend to mitigate his loss by running away? Absolutely not. Jake had already come to the conclusion that it would be impossible for him to run. His instincts told him that turning his back on his clone to escape would result in immediate death. In that case, why not try to cut his losses by fighting? It was a fallacious reasoning, but one that appealed to the proud and reckless side of his Murtharian bloodline. If he usually managed to suppress this aspect of his temperament, it was because he was relaxed and serene. At this very moment, Jake was furious and full of hatred towards his counterfeit. So what if you're bigger, stronger, faster, smarter, and more skilled than me? Do you think it's enough to kill me? Jake roared inwardly. Cough. Actually, it is enough. She dampened his enthusiasm unceremoniously, spearing his heart with a single jab. Jake stumbled as he heard his Oracle AI lashing out at him. Until now, she had always supported him. His anger only grew and his fighting intent finally made its way to his clone. Oh, you still want to fight after this beating? As long as I protect my head, what can you do to kill me? Let me tell you, nothing. Jake uttered sardonically as he donned his great helm of the Undying. Who knew he would be using that digester helmet so soon? This scrap was an ugly thing. It was closer to a chunky cylinder than a helmet, and the horizontal line serving as a visor was so narrow that he couldn't see much. So why wear it? Besides the second chance in case of decapitation, it was because this thing was made of silver chitin. Like his sword, there was no metal inside that his clone could control. Finally, this helmet was airtight. If he coated the inside with liquid alloy, his opponent would have no way to steal it. When Jake finished his preparations, there was no more empty space inside his helmet, but in return he lost all extrasensory perception of the outside. Just like when he was a mere human, he had only his 5 senses to rely on. Roar. The terrifying roar that Jake had already heard twice sounded again, and his clone's expression changed as well. Somehow, the call sounded like it was filled with anger and frustration and seemed to have come from closer. I can't play with you anymore. His opponent was no longer laughing. If I stay here any longer, I will die. We will all die. Slash. Jake threw his head back, narrowly avoiding being lopped off. A slicing wind split the rock behind him in two, but he didn't have time to gasp for mercy as he heard a supersonic shock wave to his right. If he could hear that sound, it meant that the blow had already landed on its target. Fortunately, she was in control, and a thick curtain of liquid alloy engulfed the enemy's blade, preventing it from sinking more than a few inches and spreading to his forearm to trap it in place. Seizing the opportunity, Jake teleported into the shadow of his clone and returned the favor with the fastest stabbing strike of his short life. The wind preceding this stroke pierced the chitin of the armor's back, but by the time the tip of his blade collided, his clone had already teleported back. Anticipating this move, the ground beneath Jake had already liquefied and his legs sank into it, as if he had just fallen into a ravine, allowing him to avoid another decapitation. Sadly, it was his clone in front of him, and it had also anticipated his plans. As his body sank into the ground beneath the digester also liquefied, while the ground beneath Jake suddenly became solid again. Then his opponent chopped downward, aiming for the top of his skull. Jake urgently erected a telekinetic barrier above him, while his arms off the ground counterattacked. An upturned saber slash flashed toward his clone's throat, while the claws of his free hand suddenly extended as they swung toward his heart. The digester snorted and continued his attack. His greatsword slammed into the intangible shield as Jake's sword grazed his throat. His armor and silverstone skin took most of the blow, while a slight twist of the neck neutralized the rest. As for Jake's claws, in the end, they were a bit short. At the last moment, the digester had intertwined Jake's fingers with his own claws, the clash generating a spray of sparks. With an abrupt jerk of his hand, he snapped Jake's fingers along with his claws. Going mad, Jake spat a white-hot gob of spit at his clone's face, and not expecting such a low blow, the digester reflexively blocked with his arm instead of using his telekinesis. Taking advantage of this brief blind spot, Jake seized his chance by attempting the technique he hadn't had time to try. With his sword, he tried the trick with another head slash, and his clone calmly brought his blade back to parry despite his impeded vision, but Jake was aiming for something else. As the alien blocked the blow, a telekinetic vice gripped his skull, depressurizing the atmosphere around him and threatening to blow out his eyes. His vision blurred briefly, but his own telekinetic barrier immediately countered the intrusive force. Except Jake had never intended to rely on that to win either. When the enemy's sword was about to intercept his own, it disappeared. Jake reappeared in the same position above his clone, but this time with his sword less than a millimeter from his neck. The digester shivered and leaned forward uncontrollably, before retaliating with a desperate back heel. Before Jake could make his move, his clone had teleported back. A blink of an eye later, it was he who was helplessly beheaded. The unique skill of his great helm of the Undying activated, and the silver helmet disappeared, exposing a crestfallen Jake. The only consolation, at least for now, was that Jake still had an intact head on his shoulders. This fight couldn't be won. Chapter 599 Bitter Victory. Jake was finally out of his delusion. Myrmidian pride and overwhelming fighting spirit were no longer enough to keep him from realizing the extent of his predicament. But he couldn't give up either. Running away was out of the question, and his friends needed him badly. Every second he told himself that Will's heartbreaking scream he heard wasn't as bad as he feared. But he also knew that the longer he was stuck here, the greater the chances were that his bleakest scenario would come true. Roar. The floor boss roar rang out for the third time, and this time it was no longer a distant battle cry. The top of a volcano less than a kilometer away from them disintegrated without a sound, and out of the corner of his eye he was able to see one black and one silver figure collide with unimaginable frequency. Each of these collisions was like a thunderclap, the shockwave pulverizing into ashes anything that had the misfortune to enter too close to their battlefield. After a few hundred more rounds of unbelievable violence, the two figures vanished inside the crater of the volcano, resuming their fight far from the public's eye. Not that anyone had the slightest desire to get closer to watch their duel. Still, even Jake now had a lump of apprehension in his stomach as he watched these two monstrous entities battle to the death. One of them he recognized when it stopped for a split second on a rock to catch its breath. It was Wilderth. The black orc was covered in blood and sweat. His eyes were muddy and he was wheezing hard, showing advanced signs of fatigue and shortness of breath. His body was lacerated with deep, purulent lesions, while his entire skin was charred. His armor had long since melted in the face of his enemy's fiery wrath. It was a sixth ordeal evolver, for goodness sake. At this level, a warrior had such a high constitution and vitality that he wasn't supposed to run out of steam so easily. Even if his vitality was lacking, the wounds should have at least stopped bleeding and not become infected as if his immune system was overwhelmed. Obviously, something had gone wrong. Wilderth was losing his battle. Once defeated, it would be there or his friends' turn to face this monster. Jake couldn't allow this thing near him, let alone his struggling companions. His clone was now gloomy, and as he realized that his beheading attempt had failed, he inspected his heavy greatsword with bewilderment, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong, but in vain. Unlike Jake, he knew exactly what fate awaited him if that silver figure descended upon him. His nervousness was more than apparent, and it showed in his silence. As he made his attack this time, the digester didn't utter a word, nor did he taunt him or laugh. A gravitational field pressed Jake to the ground, quadrupling his mass, and as he struggled to stand, a second telekinetic force more than 10 times his physical strength compounded the first. A halo of white light shimmered over the clone's body and the chitin tubes behind his elbows, knees, back, heels and back of his hands spat out jets of glowing plasma. The alien teleported in front of Jake and stabbed his sword directly between his eyes. Jake knew immediately that playtime was over. His clone was no longer playing. He never had a chance to win. Right now, Jake sported a twisted expression. When he should have been panicking, there was only a cold anger swirling in his eyes. His fists were shaking slightly, his body shuddering imperceptibly. When he was desperate for a solution just now, he had immersed his consciousness in the faction vault with the idea of tapping into the stored arsenal. He hadn't found the miracle weapon he craved, but his mind had stumbled upon a piece of paper smeared with blood. Both the faction chat and the Oracle system had been non-functional since their arrival in Digester territory, and in theory they had no way to communicate. Jake and many others had been stuck on this idea, but forgot that there was one thing that always worked: their faction skills. Using the faction vault, someone had handwritten a message, then dropped it in, hoping to be read. If Jake had known that such a situation would arise, they would have had a dedicated space for it. Unfortunately, because the faction vault was so large, he had never thought to look for a piece of paper. In his desperate search, he had scanned the faction vault with his bracelet and had stumbled upon this piece of paper by accident. The handwriting was Will's, but it wasn't the desperate cry for help he'd predicted. It was much worse. "Kyle is dead. Jake, don't come save us." When he saw this message, his clone's invisible blade was about to pierce his forehead and his ether soul core in the process. The sword stroke was filled with a mysterious energy that made his skin crawl. If this attack hit, Jake had no doubt about the outcome. His brain and soul would be destroyed forever. That, plus the news about Will, was too much for Jake. When someone had just lost something important and realized what they still had to lose, they would also become aware of what they were willing to sacrifice to safeguard what was left. What Jake had to do to win this fight became clear. Ether storage, 14.6 B points. Jake had something the Dungeon Digester could never emulate: his wealth. Bang! An indestructible energy barrier emerged on the surface of Jake's body, then suddenly expanded, forming an impenetrable sphere 10 meters in diameter. The super-fast, power-laden blade that was about to skewer his brain collided with the force field, then was violently pushed back along with the clone wielding it. The sphere expanded so rapidly that the Digester felt as if he had been hit by a truck. His body was propelled half a kilometer backwards, experiencing what Jake had endured earlier. Oracle Shield LVL-3 activated. Maximum range, 10 m. Effect duration, 20 seconds. Ether cost, 200 m Ether PTS per activation. Contrary to what Jake imagined, the clone showed no surprise when he met this Ether Shield. Other evolvers may have used this Oracle skill against him, or it was part of their innate memory. Before crossing the 500 meters, the alien decisively planted his greatsword in the ground to slow down his flight, digging a long trench in the ground for 100 meters. Then, once stabilized, he pushed the ground with his foot, releasing a telekinetic blast and multiple jets of plasma, and charged again. Jake squinted alertly as he watched the Digester ram fearlessly toward the supposedly invincible spherical shield. Then silently, the clone vanished, and he could guess what the monster was planning to do. Attempting a second activation of Oracle Shield LVL-3. Analysis in progress. Second activation of Oracle Shield LVL-3 allowed. Oracle Shield LVL-3 activated. A second ether shield glowed on the surface of Jake's body, just as his clone was popping up in front of him, stabbing forward at the same spot as the last time. From the way his clone's galactic eyes bulged out, Jake knew that this time the alien was surprised. When the Oracle Shield suddenly began to expand, an expression of utter horror contorted his clone's face. "You know what I have that you don't." Jake sketched a cruel smile as he saw his clone's terror. "Money. BLM." Instantly, the second shield stretched out faster than an explosion, overlapping with the first Oracle Shield. A spray of white-hot blood splattered inside the sphere. A leg and arm instantly grinded to a subatomic scale. "Gee, I missed." Jake cursed, casting a regretful look in a certain direction. "Because of you, my friend died. I could have avoided it by being less stingy, but if you hadn't blocked my way, I could have definitely helped them. For this, you shall die." His figure radiating a sinister aura disappeared from his spot, and Jake resurfaced in front of his clone 100 meters away with an arm and a leg missing. The clone immediately slashed at him, but what he dreaded happened. Attempting a third activation of Oracle Shield LVL-3. Analysis in progress. Third activation of Oracle Shield LVL-3 authorized. Oracle Shield LVL-3 activated. A third energy sphere draped over Jake's skin, blocking the clone's blade, and then the barrier expanded in turn, overlapping with the other two spheres. The clone urgently teleported again, but at the cost of another arm. With a thought, Jake stopped the expansion of the third shield, preserving the greatsword left intact inside. After storing it in his space storage, he teleported back in front of his clone, but only after recalling the third Oracle Shield to his skin. Jake had finally realized the true potential of this Oracle skill. The range of his Oracle Shield could be modulated at will within a 10-meter radius, and keep it active as long as he could afford it. Activating a second Oracle Shield was an idea he'd just had on the fly, and the result had exceeded his wildest expectations. According to Shi, it was only possible because of his Oracle rank and the fact that his bracelet held far more liquid alloy than normal. Once the method was tried and tested, the rest was predictable. After a short game of catch where Jake and his clone teleported incessantly from one point of the battlefield to another, the digester died. Yet the price of this victory was bitter. Chapter 600 His reign has just begun. Ether storage, 12.8 B points. Turning off his triple Oracle Shield, Jake let out a weary sigh. In less than 20 seconds, he had spent almost 2 billion ether points. A notorious fourth ordeal evolver like Shackler with his own faction hadn't even accumulated half that amount. Staring at the bloody slurry spread over the rock with a blank face, Jake felt only deep revulsion. Although the digester's body had been annihilated to the last particle, the dungeon remained true to its principles and granted him his rewards. A portion of the corpse's soul and ether merged with Jake after being purified by his ether and soul tribute ability. His ether stats rose by over 10% instantly, attesting to the extreme difficulty of the fight and acknowledging his unwavering valor. In comparison, the ether filament compressed by his ether storage bracelet was not worth mentioning. The real reward came just after. The remnants of chitin and blood that survived the disintegration merged with half of the remaining energy, and 2 silver gauntlets streaked with lava vein solidified at his feet. The rest evaporated into the ground, returning to the dungeon digester. A quick scan told him what he wanted to know. Intermediate ether artifact, furnace gauntlets. Gauntlets conjured from the exoskeleton of an elite rank 8 digester. Extremely durable and able to tolerate the highest temperatures. The equipment can be tempered further with more heat and radiation and a nourishing soil. Weight, 550 kilograms. Attributes, strength, plus 5%, constitution, plus 5%. Passive skill, accumulates heat, minerals and radiation from its environment to repair itself and evolve. Active skill, its user can store up to 3 heat and/or radiation spells inside and release them at the appropriate time. Remaining charges, 0/3. Under other circumstances, Jake would have been overjoyed, but thinking back on Will's message, his face could only turn gloomy. If I'd had this gauntlet before I fought my clone, would it have made a difference? Probably not. Even after winning, Jake still found it hard to believe. This monster was apparently a rank 8 digester. His ether stats should have been between 3,500 and 15,000 points. His body stats were also higher than his, as was his reaction time. His technique was also superior. He should have lost. His clone had been given plenty of chances to kill him, but miraculously, he had survived each time. Jake was not so naive as to believe that it was his outstanding combat reading and reflexes that saved him. The dungeon digester only managed to copy your bloodline and your body, not your soul. Your clone did not have your soul glyphs. She shed some light on the matter in a soft, compassionate voice. Jake nodded. If his opponent didn't have bloodline ignition, then that explained part of how he was able to close the gap between their stats. Even so, intuitively he felt that it should not have been enough. Once again, his Oracle AI had an answer ready. You owe your life to your instincts. That's what I wish I could tell you. She dropped the idea of consoling him. In the mirror universe, Instinct and luck overlap and resemble each other, one substituting for the other. The proud will think that it is instinct that guides their steps, while the humble will believe that someone or something greater than themselves is guiding them. In your case, there is no doubt that instinct alone would not have saved you. Your clone dithered too long, made too many mistakes. Some of his moves were slightly off. If you have to thank anyone for being alive, it's Tim. It was his grade 2 luck ether encoding that saved you. Jake pondered over She's words for a few seconds as he closed his eyes, then gasped. So, I'm alive only because I was lucky. Jake laughed out loud, but inwardly he felt like crying. Luck is also part of your strength. If you think it's unfair, thank Tim when you get back. Listening to the young woman's wise words, Jake quickly regained his usual composure. He was going to need a lot of luck to save a dead man. Kyle had also increased his luck ether stat to 1,000 points. Perhaps by some fluke, Providence had provided him with a way out. As long as his body and soul were not too badly damaged, there was still hope. The other crucial point was that the dungeon digester had not copied the distribution of their ether stats, nor their memories. In the end, these creatures were still digesters through and through. To evolve, they had to go through the same steps as the rest of their kind. By killing and devouring their prey, their evolution was still horribly fast. A clone of his that was only a few days old was already mature and trained enough to outperform him in every category. Jake could only imagine with a shiver of horror how many evolvers and digesters this clone had slaughtered before reaching his current level. It might explain why there are hardly any creatures on this floor. I agree with this conjecture. She assented, and then elaborated further. This digester seemed to be in a hurry, as if he had to become stronger at all costs to escape a dire fate. The digester responsible for that roar is probably another of your clones or an even more terrible creature. It's very likely the boss of this floor, but it shouldn't have been so strong. And I don't want to be around when their fight is over to find out. We'd better leave before Ural is defeated. Before leaving, Jake examined the bloody pool corresponding to his clone for more loot and found 2 more crystal spheres. A mental scan told him they were LVL-3 ether skills, telekinesis, and earth control. These skills were useless to Jake, but they could be used by one of his companions. He stored them in the faction vault and then set off. Shackler, who was shaking like a leaf after witnessing this titanic duel, didn't need to be asked to leave. The only hitch was to carefully dig up Melkri's roots without damaging the young sapling, but it turned out that they were worrying about nothing. As Jake gently moved the earth with his powers to form a bowl enclosing the roots, the tree resumed its humanoid form and the dryad reappeared before their eyes. Her face was pale and bloodless, but she could move normally. I didn't think you would win, she murmured coyly under her breath. Neither did I. Jake chuckled awkwardly, then declared with overwhelming confidence. Money is power. The aristocratic Shirl could at least agree with that statement. Just why didn't all that ether belong to him? With enough ether, those oracle skills could put the worst cheaters to shame. It was at a level that broke all the rules and broke all fairness. While he didn't envy the digester's fate, it was still frustrating. In the mirror universe, it wasn't just the digesters that were to be feared. With his vicious temper, Shackler was warier of his closest allies than his enemies. What would they do when B-842 was one day overrun by rich warlords? While the Shirl dragged his feet, tormented by his doubts, fears, and jealousy, Melkri kept walking sagely behind Jake, until he turned around and said, "Where I'm going, I won't be able to protect you. If you want to live, you'd better go back to the 3rd floor. Shackler, your order remains the same. Keep protecting Melkri." Melkri opened her mouth, but a blast of wind hit her in the face, ruffling her hair and making her cough. When the wind passed, Jake was already far away. Contemplating the immense central volcano at the end of her line of vision, the young woman remained pensive for a few seconds, but eventually decided to listen to him. To Shackler's relief, the duo turned back, hastily moving away from the danger zone. Less than a minute later, in the volcano closest to their former position, a figure covered in a nightmarish exoskeleton of silver chitin stepped heavily out of its crater. An overwhelming aura of frightening heat swirled around it, distorting the air and melting the rock at its feet with every step. Behind the humanoid monster, A charred corpse resembling those mummies found in the rubble of Pompeii was dragged miserably along the ground, its hair tightly gripped by the creature's calloused and grayish hand. The charred and desiccated body looked like a log about to crumble into ashes, but around its neck, a necklace set with blackened stones in the shape of water drops was clearly recognizable. This object was the only evidence needed to identify the victim. This charred mummy without arms or legs was the once glorious and arrogant Uraltak. After an epic duel lasting several minutes in which he had revealed the extent of his powers, used all his trump cards, and even surpassed his former limits, he had still ended up in this state. Once out of the crater, the floor boss raised his head toward the sky and let out a victorious roar that spread throughout his territory. His reign had just begun,